son of Macris, Inobri Oscarto, shouted angrily at the young lady that they were parting. Aophelia looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he meant by that. Daughter of Duke Aophelius, Via looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really breaking off the engagement. He said angrily that she knew the reason herself and he had nothing more to tell her. Everyone was whispering because they knew that the lady was bullying the girls, and it was not surprising that he decided to break off the engagement. He glanced sideways at the young lady and said, breathing heavily, that it so happened that the prince was at the party. Everyone froze and began to whisper quietly as they saw the prince. The young lady looked into the distance as she saw the prince approaching them. All the actions took place in the novel Aria, the Imperial Rose. She read the novel several times, and now she could observe the crown prince with her own eyes. She never thought she would become a character here. Especially, she didn't think she would become a supporting villain. She knew that the young lady was cannon fodder who was destined for a tragic end. The young lady was originally an office worker. She worked late overtime to help her colleagues with a presentation. As a result, she died and ended up in her favorite novel, but in the body of a hated character, and turned out to be the Duke's evil daughter. The girl was an evil character. She also ruined the family's reputation and framed the main character. As a result, she was killed by the crown prince. She knew that after the divorce, she would certainly die. She was surprised and did not understand why she was sent at such a moment. The crown prince looked at the young lady closely and asked if she had any objections to breaking off the engagement. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise. She froze in shock when she saw that he was beautiful. She was shocked because she didn't even think that the prince from the novel would be so handsome. The young lady wondered if she should create her own harem. A moment later, the young lady, looking at Aophelia, said that she must be very sad about the break-off of the engagement. The young lady, in turn, did not understand who said this, and looking intently at everyone present, was looking for who it was. The lady looked at everyone present and said that the rumors were all exaggerations, since Aophelia was a noble lady, and she could not do such a thing. She said that the cruelty and torture of people was definitely some kind of mistake. The count's daughter looked at her intently, with a smile on her face. Kalia looked at the lady with a grin and asked her to explain the situation to everyone. She said that everyone would understand. Everyone looked at the lady. They said that the count's daughter was simply very kind, and the duke's daughter was simply unworthy of her trust. When the young lady read the novel, she thought she was a strange character. She looked like a naive and kind lady, but the words are at odds with her description. Aophelia B saw that the young lady was trying to help her, but in reality she was ridiculing her lack of education. The prince looked at the young lady intently and asked if she was against breaking off the engagement. She was shocked as she realized that she had ignored the prince. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that this was not so, as she had long wanted to call off the engagement. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect such a thing. She sighed heavily and said that she actually had a lover, but because of the marriage contract, she could not say this. She looked at the young man intently and thanked him for deciding to break off their engagement. She was very happy because she knew that her fiancé was an inveterate womanizer, and after the engagement was broken off, they would talk about him a lot. The young lady sighed heavily and apologized for the banquet being interrupted due to her personal affairs. She said that she would leave immediately. Kalia looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that it was very surprising that she had a lover. She said that after the marriage contract was dissolved, they simply had to get married. She knew there were a lot of handsome men in the novel, and she needed a reason why she couldn't marry him. The young lady looked at her with a smile and said that she was very curious as to who had managed to charm her. She looked at everyone present with a smile and said that this was His Highness the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Aophelia said with a smile that she actually liked the Crown Prince. The prince, in turn, looked at the young lady with fury. He was very angry and did not understand what she was saying. In the original novel, after the engagement was broken, the Duke set up his daughter on several blind dates. Verdino Villa looked at his daughter intently and said that she should choose one husband from the list and get married. She knew that each of the candidates disliked her because of her reputation. As a result, after another date, the reputation of the young lady S became even worse. She sighed heavily because she knew that she had no choice at all, and her reputation would be ruined either way. She looked closely at the young lady as she knew something was wrong. She knew that Aophelia Fee usually acted arrogantly and hysterically, but today she was very calm. The young lady in turn looked intently at everyone present, as they thought she was in love with Crown Prince. She knew that the Crown Prince would never marry her. She was glad because she understood that now she would never get married. The prince looked at the young lady with fury and said that they had never met her. She asked with tears in her eyes if he had forgotten about their meeting. She said that her heart was about to break. The prince was shocked. She shouted that her love for him would never fade. The prince was furious and did not understand how she dared to use him as a shield. The young lady in turn mentally asked the prince for forgiveness, as she knew that she had no choice. Everyone present was shocked. They said that this simply couldn't be. They wondered if she really wanted to become the crown princess. The young lady knew that the girl was simply unworthy of standing next to the crown prince, since that place belonged to her. Aophelia ran away from this event with lightning speed. Running out into the street, she froze in place because she knew that the world was fantastic, but the sky was just as vast. She hadn't looked at the stars for a long time. The young lady froze and wondered if she really was dead. She understood perfectly well that since she was going to stay in this world forever, she had to live an ideal life. She knew that she had to do everything possible to live the perfect life. She wanted to enjoy this life very much. A moment later, the young man called the young lady and asked if she was leaving already. She was shocked and froze, looking at the handsome young man. She saw his soft blue hair flying in the wind. It was her personal knight, Laon. He told her that the carriage was ready. The young lady was shocked, as it was a character she loved very much. The young lady in turn froze in place in shock when she saw this. She looked intently at the young man, who was on all fours at her feet. The young man looked at her in bewilderment as she simply stood next to him. The young lady was shocked because she knew that Aophelia's novel had a strange habit of stepping on the knight. She came closer to him and, taking him by the hand, said that this should not be done anymore. A moment later, she herself approached the carriage. Leon froze in place, in shock. He didn't understand what had happened at all. He wondered what she had just done. He didn't understand why she had done it. She sighed heavily because she knew he hated it when she touched him. It was hard for her to see her pet and not be able to touch him. She hoped that one day he would realize that she was not like a real villain. She hoped that very soon he would stop hating her. Sometime later, she arrived at the estate, and the maid said that the master wanted to see her. The young lady knew that in the novel, the Duke was angry with his daughter and punished her. He looked at her with fury, asked what she had done today. She wondered how she could avoid punishment. The Duke looked at his daughter with fury and asked what she had done. He was beside himself with anger and asked her why she broke off the engagement. He did not understand why she confessed her love to the crown prince. The lady told the Duke that the young man was the first to raise this topic. She screamed that he publicly broke off their engagement, and everyone started thinking that something was wrong with her. She looked at her father intently and asked how she could allow her reputation to be tarnished. She sighed heavily and said that her own reputation did not matter, but the reputation of the duchy was above all else to her. He was stunned by this statement. He looked at her intently, asked if she really thought so. She looked at her father in surprise and said that of course she was doing everything for the good of the duchy. He knew that she usually immediately began to contradict because it seemed to her that everything revolved around her. But all this time, she was thinking about the duchy. He slowly approached his daughter and said that she had changed a lot. The lady in turn wondered if her excuse had worked. She sighed heavily and told her father that she felt that something was wrong with him breaking off the engagement with her, so she decided to change. The Duke shouted furiously that this was nonsense, and his daughter was fine. He shouted that it was the young man's fault. She looked at him in surprise. The young lady was surprised, as she knew that the novel had never shown this side of the Duke. The Duke asked his daughter if she really liked the prince, or if it was just an excuse. She said that he was a very worthy man, so she fell in love at first sight. The Duke looked at his daughter intently and said that he understood everything and now she could go. She was surprised, looked at him, but still agreed. She heard that the servant brought the Duke a list of candidates. The Duke said with a smile that he was no longer needed, since after talking with his daughter, he had changed his plans. The young man froze in shock when he saw that the Duke was smiling. He was surprised, for he knew that the Duke had not smiled once since the Duchess died. The young lady sighed heavily. She was very scared. She had read many novels, but she didn't think that such situations were so scary. She knew that the Duke was very different from the way he was portrayed in the novel. She sighed heavily, as she was glad that everything worked out. She was a little puzzled, as she didn't know where to go. A moment later, she heard some noise in the room. The head maid was shouting at the maid and saying that when the mistress returned, she would punish her. She froze and wondered if they were talking about her. Entering the room, she saw that the maid was sitting on the ground and trembling with fear. The young lady entered the room, and the maid bowed to her. The young lady was furious. She looked at those present and asked what was happening now. Rona said that girl D had made a mistake because she had broken the mistress's favorite teapot, and she had taught her a lesson. Yor shouted that it was not her fault at all. Looking at the lady, she said that she was ordered to come into the room, and when she entered, the head maid was already standing with a kettle. She screamed that she hadn't dropped it at all, and when she arrived, it was already broken. The head maid looked at the maid with fury and asked if she really meant to say that she was the one who broke it. The young lady looked at those present and told everyone to be silent. She went up to the maid and asked her to stand up. She came closer to her and said with a smile that everything was fine and she could get up. She said that the maid had burned her hand and needed to put some medicine on it. The maid froze in shock as she did not expect such a thing from the young lady. The young lady looked at the head maid and told her to go and tidy up the room. She was shocked because she didn't expect this. She looked closely at the young lady, Ophelia. She looked at the maid with fury and asked, did she really have any more questions? The young lady knew that it was sometimes useful to pretend to be a villain. The maid sighed heavily and said that she had no questions. A moment later, the maid began to clean up the broken glass. The young lady was a little puzzled. She knew that being a real Ophelia was not easy. Everyone looked at the young lady with disdain. They said that she was using magic to harm the young lady. They looked at her with fury and at the same time shouted that she must die. She asked the crown prince to listen to her, but he did not want to. The young lady woke up from a terrible nightmare. She screamed involuntarily. A moment later, she sighed heavily, for she knew that this was her future, which she had to avoid at all costs. A moment later, she heard the maid knocking on the door and asking her if she was awake. Opening the door, she saw the head maid, who brought her an invitation from Natlin's family. The young lady was surprised because she knew that this was an invitation from Kalaya. She wondered what her wife was up to. This time, young lady. The young lady sat quietly sipping her tea and staring at the invitation. She was remembering what was in the novel. She knew that in the novel, after a nasty quarrel at the ball, the young lady invited her to tea so that they could make peace. But everything again came down to the villainess, causing a scandal. Everyone looked at them intently and discussed as the young lady began to quarrel again. Ophelia, with lightning speed, picked up the cup of tea and poured it over the young lady. Everyone was shocked, and looking at Kalia, they supported her and cursed the villain Ophelia. She, in turn, really wanted to avoid a tragic ending. She really wanted to live this life peacefully. She wanted to change her image in the eyes of others. She knew that she had to go to this event. She knew she had to get rid of the clothing mishap. Opening the closet, she remembered what exactly Ophelia had been wearing at the tea party. Looking out into the corridor, she called the maid. She looked at the maid with a smile and asked her to arrange a carriage for her. She knew that she needed to buy a new outfit. Sometime later, they came to the city in search of a new outfit. The young lady looked at her knight in surprise and asked what was wrong with his face. He sighed heavily and, looking away from her, said that everything was fine. She was worried and said that if something happened, he could tell her. The knight was furious. He pushed the young lady away and said that she should not touch him. He said angrily that she knew what was going on and asked if she was deliberately making fun of him. The maid looked at the knight with fury and asked how he dared to speak like that to a young lady. The knights seized the young man with lightning speed, and the young lady in turn screamed and demanded that he be released. He looked at her with a smirk and said that if she wanted to punish him, she could just do it the normal way. The young lady in turn said to let him go. The maid was shocked, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She turned around and asked with cold fury if they hadn't heard the young men obeyed her order. The young lady in turn shouted to her knight to return to his place and not to show his face to her anytime soon. The maid said that she would immediately call her another knight, but the young lady said that this was not necessary. She sighed heavily and said that she only wanted her knight. He froze from the man, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The lady in turn drove into the shopping area. She was surprised because she saw that it was very busy. She looked at the coachman and told him to stop, as she wanted to go shopping. She walked slowly and looked at everything closely. She was shocked because she wanted to buy everything. With lightning speed, her love for shopping was activated. But a moment later, her playful mood vanished as the man nearly knocked her off her feet. She froze in shock and stared after him, but a moment later she realized that her wallet had been stolen. She was shocked and looked intently after the young man. A moment later she screamed furiously at him to stop. She rushed towards him with fury and screamed all the way for him to stop. With the speed of lightning, she rushed past the young man, and he lost his hat. Suddenly, the man ran into a girl who was selling apples. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock as she saw apples falling on her. She was puzzled because she could not move. Opening her eyes, she saw that someone had thrown an apple right into her hands. She was surprised and did not understand what was happening, as she saw that an unknown man was chasing the thief. A moment later, the thief was pinned to the ground. She looked at us in surprise at everything that was happening. A moment later, she approached the young man and asked if he was okay. He looked at her with a smile and handed her her purse. She was surprised and thanked him. The young man looked at her with a smile and said that he was very glad to help such a lovely lady. Ophelia Z froze in shock as she was faced with a perfect young man, but a moment later she screamed as she noticed that the thief had attacked the young man with a knife. The man reacted with lightning speed and grabbed the thief by the arm, causing the thief to drop his knife. The young lady froze in place in surprise as she saw that the young man quickly fought back against the thief. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she must have been very scared. She looked at him intently and said that it was not so. She was surprised and did not understand what kind of world it was, since every man was strikingly handsome. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he could wait a little. The young man smiled and said that of course he would wait. The young lady, in turn, slowly approached the girl who was selling apples. Ophelia helped the girl to collect all the apples and also asked if she could take them. She said that she would definitely pay her. The young man looked at the lady in surprise. He did not understand what she was doing. He noticed that she had paid for the goods with gold coins. Some time later, a young lady slowly approached him with a basket of apples. She thanked him for helping her return her purse. She also decided to thank him with sweets. She said that she would like to invite him to dinner, but she had other things to do. She hoped that he would like the gift. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she had said, "Thank you" too many times during their brief meeting. He smiled and asked if they would meet again. The young lady smiled and said that they would definitely meet. He looked at her intently and said with a beaming smile that, in that case, he would look forward to meeting her. The young lady was shocked because she saw that he was a real gentleman. He sighed heavily and said that she was not as arrogant as rumors said. He told his assistant that they needed to conduct a thorough investigation. The man looked at him intently and said that he would do everything he said, that everything connected with her prince needed to be investigated. A moment later, he threw all her gifts into the trash can. She looked at the outfit because she knew that the biggest problem was solved because no lady would come to a party in such a plain outfit. Entering the estate, she heard some terrible rumble and scream. The head maid screamed furiously that food had been disappearing from the kitchen lately, and she had finally found the thief. The young lady looked at the maid and said that the beta had let her go. The head maid screamed furiously that this time she had stolen bread, and next time it might be the young lady's jewelry. The head maid shouted that they needed to punish the maid immediately. The young lady frowned and thought. She looked at the maid with a sharp gaze and asked if she had stolen anything. The maid said with tears in her eyes that this is how it was. The young lady came closer to the maid and, looking into her eyes, asked why she did this. The maid was surprised because she saw that her mistress did not hit her. Ophelia looked at her intently and asked if she was hungry. The maid of crying said that her brother was free, and all the money went to medicine, so she could not watch him die of hunger. She said that this was the reason she stole leftovers from the kitchen. She asked if the boy worked on their estate. She did not understand why no one helped him. The maid said he was too young to work. A moment later, the young lady handed her the dessert. She looked closely at the maid and said that if something happened, she could tell her, and then she wouldn't have to steal. The lady smiled and told the maid to go home and eat the cake with her brother. The maid thanked her mistress with tears in her eyes. Some time later, she thanked her with tears in her eyes. The head maid looked at the lady in surprise and said that he was a thief maid. She could not understand how the lady let her go. She told the young lady that if this was not stopped, then others would do the same. The young lady in turn said with fury that it was primarily her fault as the head maid. She looked at the maid with fury and said that she would let her go today, but that this must not happen again. The maid was shocked because she did not expect such a thing, but she still agreed with the young lady. Ophelia told the maid that they were not stupid and that such things could not be allowed to come out. She knew that in the novel, the maid often complained about those she didn't like. She regretted that now there was no one who could take over the job of head maid. The young lady, in turn, very much hoped that he, the maid, would stop doing this. She knew that she needed to raise someone to take the place of the head maid. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily as she arrived at the place where the tea party was to take place. She noticed that he was the crown prince. He came very early. She thought that he would be late. She looked at him intently, thinking that he had simply been forced to come. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and wondered if she really didn't have money for normal clothes. Ophelia was in shock. She didn't understand what his look meant. She knew that compared to the cold prince, the guy who saved her was much nicer. She wondered what family he was from. She knew his name had to appear in the novel. A moment later, her entire beautiful view was blocked by young aristocrats. The young ladies looked at her with fury and disdain and asked if she was really trying to get close to the crown prince again. They mocked her and said that they were not thick-skinned enough to confess their love to the crown prince in front of everyone. They mocked her and asked if she was not ashamed of her behavior. The aristocrats mockingly said that Kalia, more than anyone else, deserved to be next to the crown prince. The prince knew perfectly well that if she was ready to use him as a shield, then she had to be ready to become a target. She smiled and asked if the prince had come and whispered in their ears at night that he liked Kalia. The lady was furious. She said it was very rude of her, and she would never compare to Kalia. She looked at her closely and said that everyone thought that she was not suitable for the prince. The young lady asked with a smirk if this was true. She looked at everyone intently and said that then they should raise their hands if they thought that Kalia was suitable for the crown prince. Everyone froze in place and no one raised their hand. They did not want to participate in this. But a moment later, the young ladies raised their hands. They were puzzled and did not understand why I would do what she said. She looked at the prince with a smile and said that he looked, because there are ladies who decided to make the choice for him. The young lady was shocked. They didn't expect this from her. They felt the crown prince's gaze on them, and they became very scared. He said angrily that it was purely his personal business whom he married, and he did not want to hear anything more from them. He said angrily that if they had not been taught etiquette, then they should stay home and keep a low profile. The young man looked at the lady with a smile and thought that she was not bad at her job. Kalia was furious as she realized that, as the hostess of the tea party, it was her fault for allowing them to discuss the prince. She looked at the prince intently and said that she was very sorry that everything had happened this way. He looked at her sideways, as if he didn't understand what was happening. Kalia came up to the young lady with lightning speed and said that the girls had been too rude and she should forgive them. She smiled and said that everything was fine, since these words did not offend her. Kalia smiled and told the young lady that if she didn't mind, they could sit together. Ophelia agreed with a smile. Kalia smiled and said that these desserts were prepared by her new pastry chef. She looked at the dessert with a smile and said that everyone present could try whatever they wanted. The young lady, in turn, remembered that in the novel, a huge scandal had occurred during the tea party. She looked closely at the dessert because she remembered that someone had died from it. She knew that one of the girls had an allergy to peanuts. After the girl ate the dessert, her condition worsened and she fell unconscious. Kalia reacted immediately, called the doctor, and thanks to her, the girl was saved and she won universal praise. The crown prince was also impressed by her calm in the emergency. The young lady, in turn, wondered if he liked Kalia. She understood that it would be difficult to use him as protection in the future. She knew that for the sake of her future, he couldn't fall in love with her. At least, not yet. She knew she had to be first. She wanted to quickly find the girl with the allergy in order to prevent a tragedy. She knew that the description said that the girl was very thin and weak and also had small freckles. She was shocked because she saw that everyone present looked the same. A moment later, one of the girls told Anna to try a wonderful dessert. Ophelia B. remembered that her name was Anna. She saw the young lady slowly offer a piece of dessert to the group. With lightning speed, the young lady ran up to her and intercepted her hand. Everyone present was in shock and did not understand what Ophelia was doing. The lady smiled and apologized. She said that Anna's cake looked very tempting. She asked if she would like to swap with her. The young ladies were shocked because they did not expect this. Kalia looked at the lady closely and said with a smile that if she wanted the same cake, she could bring another one. Ophelia whispered quietly in Anna's ear. She looked at her intently and asked if she would give her the cake now. The girl looked intently at Anna and asked what the lady had told her. Anna looked at her friend in surprise and said that there were peanuts in the cake. The young lady, in turn, was furious. Since she did not understand what the problem was, Anna quietly said that everything was fine. The prince looked at the girls in surprise because he thought they were strange, since they were arguing over a piece of cake. The prince looked at the young man and asked what was wrong. He smiled and said that everything was fine. He said with a smile that now he wondered how tasty that cake was, since the lady had gone so far. The prince sighed heavily and said that it did not matter, since a noble lady should not cause a stir in public. The young man was surprised, as this was the first time the prince had commented on her actions. He thought he was not interested lady, but he saw that the prince could not take his eyes off her. He thought that he should get closer to the lady. After the young lady took the cake, she sighed heavily because she was happy. She wanted to show that she was a perfect lady, but she turned out as usual. A moment later, she froze in place as she heard someone calling her. She turned around and saw the young lady running towards her. Ophelia was surprised. Anna said that even her friends didn't notice. She didn't understand how the young lady knew that she didn't eat peanuts. Ophelia Z froze in place from shock. She did not know what to answer. She was puzzled because she knew she couldn't say she had read the novel and knew about it. She didn't know what to answer. Kalia told the prince that she was very sorry that he had to hear such things. She did not expect ladies to say such things. He asked in surprise what she was talking about. She smiled and said that she was talking about how they were perfect for each other. The prince was distracted by looking at the young ladies, as he heard Anna S. say that her friends did not notice, but the lady noticed that she did not eat peanuts. She smiled and said that she just liked peanut butter candies, so she decided to swap with her. Anna smiled and thanked her for saving her life today. The prince, in turn, looked intently at the young lady and was lost in the question of whether this was really a coincidence. Kalia looked at the prince intently, not taking her gaze off him. She was furious and didn't understand why he kept looking at the lady. She thanked the prince for coming to the event and also asked if he liked the dessert. He frowned at the young lady and said nothing. A moment later, he said that it was time for him to go. Kalia was furious. She knew that Ophelia had ruined everything again. The Duke looked closely at his daughter and asked her how her day had been. She smiled and said everything was wonderful, but in turn, she knew it was a lie. The desserts were tasteless. She was always being made fun of. No one wanted to see her at the event. She sighed heavily because she knew the day was terrible. He looked at her intently and said that he heard that the crown prince was at the event. He looked at her intently and said that he did not want her to marry the prince. She asked in surprise if he did not meet his requirements. He said he wants her to marry a man who can protect her, and he doesn't want her life to be full of dangers. The young lady was shocked because in the novel, he hardly cared about his daughter. She was surprised because she saw that he was a very caring father and surprisingly loved his daughter. He said there was a rebellion on the border, and the emperor sent the crown prince at the head of the army. He said she should understand how dangerous it was. The Duke sighed heavily and said that if she became the crown princess, she would have to shoulder the fate of the country. She was surprised because she had simply told him that she liked the prince. She did not understand why his attitude had changed so much. She froze as she remembered that the novel said that the prince had failed. The spy had given the battle plan to the enemy. Because of this, the crown prince was not only injured, but also demoted by the emperor. She knew that if she helped him at such a critical moment, then in the future he would help her. She knew that this was just the perfect chance. She wrote a letter to the prince to tell him everything she wanted to give it to him personally, so that no one would read the contents. Sometime later, the prince received a letter from the ducal house. The knight informed the prince that it was from a young lady. The prince quickly threw the letter away as he was not interested. The next day, she sighed heavily because she knew that since she could not get to the appointment, she wanted to wait for him. A moment later, she noticed the crown prince and asked with a smile if they could talk. The young lady was shocked. She looked at the prince and saw his cold and angry gaze. She was puzzled because he had caused her hat to fly away, and at the same time she was trembling with fear. The young lady did not give up. She came to him the next day. She decided to come to him with a gift in order to win his favor. She put a note in the box that he would want to read. She noticed the prince and asked him to accept her gift. As he was leaving, he said that he did not want to do this. A moment later, the young lady accidentally dropped the box on the ground. She was furious because she knew he was just being stubborn. She screamed angrily. The young ladies looked at her intently. They were mocking her because the crown prince did not accept the gift from the lady. She was furious because she just wanted to help him. She didn't understand why he was so mean. She was surprised because she knew he didn't care about her attempts. She sighed heavily because she knew that they would soon be on their way. She did not know what to do. A moment later, there was a knock at the young lady's door, and she gave her permission for the maid to enter. The maid looked at the young lady and said that the Duke wanted to see her. Ophelia asked her father if he was looking for her. She was surprised and did not expect that her father would call her. He looked at her intently and told her to come into the office and sit down. A moment later, he said that she should look at the documents. The young lady asked in surprise what kind of documents were in front of her. He smiled and said that this information was about guys her age. Since the crown prince is very good, but without him, there are enough outstanding people. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect this. She knew perfectly well that if they all lined up, it would stretch for 10 miles. The Duke looked at his daughter and asked her to give up the crown prince, since all he did was give up her. The lady was shocked because she realized that her father had already heard all the stories. Ophelia was puzzled. She didn't know how to get out of it. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and said that the prince did not like her, and that was his problem. He said that he would always support her. The young lady looked at her father intently and said that everything he heard was just rumors. She looked at the Duke intently and said that she had a reason why she had to meet the crown prince. She said that he would soon be heading to the border. She said with a smile that after she looked at the map, she had a couple of ideas. A moment later, the young lady began to tell her father the plan of action. He looked at his daughter with surprise and a smile, as he did not expect to hear something like that from her. She looked at her father closely and said that this was what she wanted to offer the crown prince. She hoped that it would impress him. He asked if she had thought of this on her own. He sighed heavily and said that they remembered her studying strategy. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback as she did not know what to answer. A moment later, she looked closely at the chess and said with a smile that she had simply overplayed the chess. She smiled and said that she had read a lot about strategy. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and said with a smile that she had been astonishing him lately. The young lady said with a smile that it was all thanks to him. In turn, she remembered the presentation. She knew that it was not so difficult. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and said with a smile that he would certainly convey her strategy to the prince. She knew that this was her victory. The next day, she received an invitation from the palace. The young lady knew that she was invited by the crown prince. The maid smiled and told the young lady that the crown prince would come to her soon. The young lady, in turn, was very glad that she was finally able to meet the prince. The prince looked at her intently and asked if she was not angry that he had avoided meetings and had influenced the spread of rumors. The lady looked at him intently and asked with a smile why she should be angry. She smiled and said that it didn't matter to her at all. Ophelia said she couldn't blame him for not wanting to meet her after everything she had done. The prince looked at her intently and said that the Duke had said that the strategy had been suggested by her. She smiled and said that it was exactly so. He looked at her intently and asked if she knew that he would use this strategy and not come back, and therefore her entire family would die. She asked with a smile if her strategy was in line with his. She smiled and asked if he didn't want to use her like she belonged to her. She looked at the prince with a smile and asked if he was really going to blame the duchy for it if it failed. He looked at her closely and said that she was right, because his strategy was slightly similar to hers. She knew that they were not just similar, but the same. She simply told her father the strategy that was described in the novel, that was the only way she could get his attention. She looked at the prince intently and said that she strongly recommended that he abandon this strategy. She knew that the enemy country had figured out his strategy. She looked at him intently and asked how he could guarantee that the enemy had not discovered his plan. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that she could sit down and they would discuss everything. The young lady looked at the desserts warily as they smelled strongly of peanuts. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked if all the cakes were peanuts. The prince was surprised. He told the chef to prepare a couple of desserts in with peanuts, but I don't understand why they made so many of them. The young lady was amazed, as these desserts were much better than those she had tried at tea. The prince looked at her closely and noticed that she really liked peanuts. He looked at her intently and said he had a better idea. She looked at him in confusion, but a moment later she smiled and said she had the perfect distraction. The young man, in turn, watched them closely from the side. He asked his subordinate what they were talking about. The young man said that as far as he knew, the lady had proposed a plan to attack the Xi'an Empire to the prince. He was surprised, as he did not expect that this noble lady knew anything about strategy. For a moment he thought, and said with a grin, that the girl was very amazing. He wanted to know more about her. The maid looked at the young lady with a smile, and said that she had brought her younger brother to her. She smiled, and said that his name was Tien. The maid thanked the lady for her help, as her brother was able to fully recover, and today she brought him so that he could thank the lady. The young man bowed obediently, and thanked the young lady for her help. The young lady in turn said with a smile that there was nothing to thank her for. She was glad, because she knew that the main thing was that he had recovered and was doing well. Yours, with tears in her eyes, told the young lady that if it were not for her, anything could have happened to the child. She told the lady that she was their benefactor. Yours smiled and told the lady that she could ask her for anything, and she would do everything possible. Ophelia looked at the maid intently and asked with a smile if she wanted to become her personal maid. She knew it was a great opportunity. Yor, with tears in her eyes, agreed with the young lady and said with a smile that it was a great honor for her. The young lady in turn was very happy because she knew that everything was going just fine. She had done a favor for the crown prince, and he was now indebted to her. She had gotten herself a servant. The young lady was shocked because everyone thought that she was really crazy about the prince. It was only because of the rumors that she wanted to sleep with the prince that the maid decided that she really liked him, and so she decided to help. The young lady watched everyone closely as they shouted and called for the crown prince. She knew that he was leaving today, and her maid made her come and see him off. The young lady sighed heavily, as she had to agree. A moment later she met the crown prince's gaze. She was in shock because it was all because of damn rumors. She wanted to go home as soon as possible. Ophelia closely, and said that there were many ladies seeing off the crown prince now, and she needed to be more active. Ophelia sighed heavily. She was shocked, since she should have thought before saying that she liked the crown prince. Everyone looked at the prince and shouted to him, as if they wanted to give him their gifts. The prince looked coldly at everyone present and said that he did not need anything. Kalia looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that she had prepared some medicine for him and he should take it. The prince said that he did not need anything, and P hurried away from her. The young lady was in shock. She asked the prince to wait a little. All the ladies present were surprised because they thought that the crown prince would accept the gift from Kalaya. They did not expect that the white rose would be rejected. The young lady was surprised and wondered if the plot had changed. She knew that in the novel, the prince accepted the gift from Kalaya. Ophelia realized that her efforts were not in vain after tea. The young noblewomen looked at the lady with mockery and asked what she was happy about. They asked if she really thought that since the prince had rejected Kalaya's gift, that she had a chance. They said that she could not even dream of it, since he would not even look at her gift. Ophelia looked at them intently and asked if they hadn't learned from their mistakes. She asked with a smirk if they had forgotten what the crown prince had told them. Yor looked closely at the young lady and said that she should show the aristocrats and deal with them. Ophelia was shocked because she did not expect this. The maid looked at her mistress intently and said with a smile that she believed in her and she should win. The young lady in turn knew that her maid was the only one who was mocking her now. She looked at the prince intently and wondered what she should do now, since she had not prepared anything for him at all. She slowly took a handkerchief from her purse and asked if he would accept her handkerchief. Everyone present was shocked as she presented the crown prince with a handkerchief, even without a box. All the ladies present were shocked. They did not understand how she could give him such a terrible gift. Kalia smiled and told her friends not to say that. She said that the prince would not accept the gift, and they in turn were just trying to prove how important he was to them. The prince looked closely at the young lady and asked if this was really her handkerchief. She looked at him in surprise. A moment later, the prince accepted her gift. Everyone present was shocked, as they did not expect the prince to accept her terrible gift. The young lady in turn froze in shock on the spot. The prince slowly approached her and quietly whispered in her ear that this time he helped her. A moment later, the prince kissed her hand tenderly and said that in gratitude, she should promise him that when he returned victorious, she would do something for him. The young lady in turn froze in shock. She had not expected such a thing from him on the spot. She was shocked because she realized that he had not helped her, and S had only made things worse since all the young ladies present wanted to bite her alive. She was shocked and screamed that he only made things worse, but she understood that there was no way out of this situation. Reynolds looked at her with a smile on his face and said that she should remember this. Ophelia was shocked. He really pissed her off. Ur looked closely after the prince and said with a smile to her mistress that she knew her feelings would be noticed. Ophelia was in shock. She understood perfectly well that at this rate she would soon die. A week later she sat and thought about everything, her head filled with disturbing thoughts. Ophelia could not stand it and screamed she was furious and did not know what the crown prince wanted from her. Ur looked closely at her brother and told him to be quiet and not disturb the young lady. Ophelia looked at Tien intently. She had completely forgotten about him. She looked at him with a smile and called out. Ophelia asked him with a smile if he really liked swords. He looked at her in surprise and said that that was exactly it. She smiled and asked if he wanted to learn fencing. The boy looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She smiled and said that she had a very good teacher for him. Leon looked intently at the young lady and asked if she had called him. She smiled and told her knight that she very much hoped that he could train the little boy, as he wanted to know how to handle a sword. The knight looked at the boy intently but said nothing. A moment later, he said that he would not do that. The young lady, in turn, was surprised. She did not expect to hear such a thing, and looking at him, asked why he decided so. Ur said with a smile that her brother was of common origin, and asking a knight to teach the boy was simply inappropriate. Tien, in turn, was very upset as he did not expect to hear something like this. The knight looked closely at the boy, and sighing heavily, said that this was not the reason at all. Leon looked closely at his mistress and asked for forgiveness for his rudeness. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. The maid was in shock, did not understand what the knight wanted to do with the lady. She shouted after them, but everything was clear. The young lady looked at her maid and said that everything was fine, and there she can go and have some fun with her brother, and she will talk to the knight and come soon. The knight looked at the young lady intently and asked if the child was her new toy. She was shocked and said that of course it wasn't. She didn't understand why he was asking her such a thing. Ophelia wondered what kind of person she seemed to be in his eyes. Leon asked angrily why she wanted him to teach him. He said that if the boy became his student, everyone would laugh at him. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked who he was talking about. The young man was furious because he understood that she was beautiful, knew everything, but pretended not to know anything. He looked at her closely and said with a grin that it seemed she had forgotten something, but he would help her remember everything. She was shocked because she saw that he took the sword out of its sheath. She was puzzled and did not understand why he was so angry with her. She wondered if he really wanted to stab her. She was in shock because she understood that this time she was doomed and her life was coming to an end. A moment later, the knight threw his sword at the feet of the young lady. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what was happening. She knew that the knight's life was his sword. She did not understand why he simply threw it on the ground. He sighed heavily and said that a few years ago, his family had done something very wrong. They should have been wiped off the face of the earth, and after which, she said that she adored his appearance and took him back to the Duke's mansion and allowed him to become her knight. He said that if he needed to protect her, then he was okay with it. He said that she should remember that she was the one who did this to him. He said that when she was bored, she made him wear women's clothes. He said she watched with a smirk as he defended himself from the hound. He sighed heavily and said that she wanted to humiliate him so much that she allowed others to make fun of him, and this was her favorite show. He said he was a knight, but his sword was not used to protect his lady, but to protect his own life from other knights who wanted to take revenge on him every single day. The young lady was shocked because she understood perfectly well that she did not do all this, and he had to endure all this because of the whims of the real Aophelia. He looked at her with fury and said that she was well aware of everything that was happening. He did not understand why she would ask him now what he was talking about. The young lady looked at him intently and wondered if the mark on his face had been left early by the other knights. Now she understood perfectly well that it was no wonder that he got angry when she asked him, since she had not really paid attention to the kind of abuse he had been subjected to. He looked at the young lady with fury and asked if it wasn't enough for her that he was being humiliated, and now she wanted the boy to be bullied too. He said with tears in his eyes that if she had no more business with him, then he would go. Aophelia was in shock. She stared at him because she knew that she was no longer the same as he remembered. She knew full well that he had faced many difficulties in the original, but she knew that he never gave up. She knew that in the last battle, he had a damaged sword, and that was the reason he lost. She was puzzled and knew that she simply couldn't allow this fact to happen. She knew that the mission to protect the little wild wolf cub began right now. She looked intently at her maid and said with a smile that she was going for a walk. The maid looked at her mistress intently and said that she would go with her. She said with a smile that there was no need to do this and that she could handle it herself completely. Some time later, the young lady went out into the city. She went to the armory to buy a beautiful sword for her knight. She looked intently at the beautiful swords, as she did not know which one to choose. Now she understood the feeling of men when they had to look at shades of lipstick. She was shocked and knew that none of them suited him. She did not know what to choose. A moment later, the young man looked at her closely and with a smile said that she could go into the shop, as there was more choice there. The young lady slowly walked inside the store and froze in shock. She knew that now it would be even more difficult for her to choose. She looked at the man intently and asked what the most expensive sword in his shop was. She understood perfectly well that if you don't know what to choose, you can just take the most expensive sword. She knew that a good sword is expensive. The man looked at her with a smirk on his face and asked her to wait a bit. He said that they would alternately bring her what she was looking for. He saw that she knew nothing about weapons, and this was his chance. He looked at her with a smirk and said that she could take a look at the goods, as they were all of high quality, and each sword was worth 1,000,000 gold. The young lady in turn coughed from all the dust. She looked at the man in surprise and said that they seemed very old. The man looked at the young lady with a grin and said that she did not understand anything, since these were the most ancient swords, and that was why the price was so high. He smiled and said that all the swords were from ancient times, and they were all good in their own way. He said that if she chose one of the proposed ones, they would definitely help her in battle. The young man looked closely at the young lady. He saw that she was ready to buy a fake. He looked at her with a smile, because he understood that he should help her so that she would not do something wrong. He had not yet entered the shop when he heard a crash and a scream. The young lady in turn furiously asked the man if he was trying to cheat her. Aophelia looked at the man closely and said that magic swords with abilities were not just cabbage, which was everywhere. She did not understand where he got so many swords from. The man was shocked. He was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. But a moment later he said that his store was well stocked. Aophelia looked at him intently and said that he was just a speculator. She shouted with fury that she was a fool to believe him. Aophelia knew that if it were not for another world, she would have made him swear. A moment later the young lady saw her friend. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he also wanted to buy a sword. He froze in place without saying a word. With lightning speed, she grabbed his hand and dragged him away. She said that he should not buy anything in the shop, as it was a complete scam. The man shouted after them that if she did not take anything, then she should not scare away his customers. The young man looked at her closely and said that she was very perceptive. He wanted to come in and help her understand that the man was a fraud, but in the end she helped him. The young lady looked at him with a smile because she was surprised. She knew that if she hadn't read the novel, she would hardly have understood this. She knew that according to the plot, a magic sword can only be encountered by chance, but not found in a store. The young man looked at her intently and asked if she was free now. She looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. He smiled and said that they could go for a walk together. The young lady smiled and agreed with him. She said that she was sure that he knew much more about swords than she did. She smiled and said that he could help her find one sword. Ophelia, in turn, understood perfectly well that she could not refuse the invitation of such a handsome man. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that the cake she bought him last time was very delicious. She smiled and asked if it was true. Ophelia knew that Tian Toji had said that the cake was delicious. A moment later, the young lady glanced at him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what had happened. The young lady was unable to utter a word. She was frozen in place from shock. She saw the very sword that was supposed to kill her. She stared at him, frozen in place. She was in shock as she was shaking. She could not utter a word. The young man looked at her in surprise and said that she should calm down. He said that she should breathe deeper. He looked at her in surprise and asked what happened. He asked if she was feeling unwell. She sighed heavily and said that she felt a little unwell. The young man said that, in that case, he would take her home. He froze in surprise as she suddenly moved away from him. She sighed heavily and asked him to wait a little. She was in shock and understood that this magic sword should not fall into the hands of the crown prince. Ophelia understood perfectly well that he could end her life with the sword. She slowly approached the man and asked how much the sword cost. She knew that since she had met the sword before the crown prince, she could take it for herself. The man looked at her and said that the sword itself must choose its buyer, and she was not suitable. A moment later, she placed on his table a whole bag of gold coins, and with a grin, asked if she was now suitable. The man froze in shock, but for a moment he said that he would now see if she was suitable or not. The young man looked closely at the sword and said that it was rusty and stained and would be useless. The man sighed heavily, looking at the gold coins. He said that his sword was not cheap because it would be very useful to its owner. The young man looked at the young lady intently and said that she should listen to him and not take the sword. A moment later, the man easily threw the sword into the hands of the young lady. Looking at the young man, he said that he did not want her to buy it, but he needed to sell the sword. The man gathered all his things with lightning speed and slowly left. The young lady, in turn, thanked the young man for his advice, but she still said that she liked him too much and she simply could not take her eyes off him. The young man looked at her intently, but said nothing. He saw that she was just a stupid girl, but with money, he knew that with such eyesight, it was not surprising that she fell in love with the crown prince. The young lady, in turn, looked closely at her new purchase. She had not thought at all that she would buy it. She knew that now she was its new owner, and she could not be killed. The young lady looked at the young man in surprise and asked if he had just called her by name. The young man was shocked as he realized that in his haste, he had accidentally revealed that he knew her. He looked at her intently and said with a grin that it was all so, since he had seen her at the tea party at Natalit's house. The young lady, in turn, the heir of the mule, as she remembered what happened at the event. She realized that after everything that happened, he simply could not help but notice her. She looked closely at the young man and said with a smile that she still didn't know his name. She smiled and said that she would introduce herself more formally now. She extended her hand to him, and he froze in surprise. He wondered if she wanted him to kiss her. He smiled and said his name was Ducis Ilter. The young lady, in turn, pulled her hand back with lightning speed and froze in shock on the spot. She was shocked and, looking at the young man, wondered if it was really him. She knew that according to the novel, he was a villain. She was shocked and wondered if the good man who was now in front of her was a cold-blooded usurper. The emperor had only 3 children: the late queen's son, Crown Prince Reynold, and the queen's second daughter, Princess Gwen. The emperor had a child with the queen's servant. The second prince, Deuces, was rumored to have appeared only as a result of a drunken mistake made by the emperor. At that time, the bloodline was highly valued, so he was an illegitimate child whom no one respected. The emperor, in turn, valued only the crown prince, so for Deuces, Reynold was just a wall that blocked his father's attention. And although the crown prince cared for his brother, he perceived it as humiliation and charity. The young man, in turn, hid his true feelings behind a smile and prepared a plan for revenge. He really wanted to surpass his brother and show it to his father, so he slowly began to grow. Preparing step by step, he turned into the tip of a sword. In the battle with the other empire, he was the one who framed the crown prince and killed him on the battlefield, leaving him to bleed to death. Ophelia, in turn, understood perfectly well that the young man was thoughtful, so every action of his was not meaningless. She was shocked and did not understand why he was so kind to her. She knew that in the novel, he did not pay attention to the young lady. She did not understand at all why everything was happening this way. A moment later, the young lady froze in place as she heard some noise in the distance. She looked in surprise at the maid who was staring at the sword. She looked at her intently and asked what she was doing. The maid looked at her mistress with a smile and said that she was now wiping her new sword. She told her mistress that it was very rusty and dull. She even cut it with a rag, but she didn't even cut herself, and it seemed to her that it was not fit for use. Yor said that even if it was used as a decoration, it was too inconspicuous. The young lady said, with a smile, that it was all because it had not awakened yet. The maid asked the mistress in surprise what she was talking about. She smiled and said that this sword was unusual because it was a magic ball that had consciousness. She smiled and said that the sword would stand battered after losing its owner like a dragon that goes into a deep sleep, and he waits until the magical power makes him wake up and shine again. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if it was like bribes first. Someone buys a sword, and later he works for the owner. She said in surprise that it was like selling your soul to the devil. The young lady looked at the maid with a smile and said that her words were true. She knew that this was the method by which the people in the novel received the approval of the sword. Since the crown prince, the protagonist of the novel, the sword immediately recognized his master. She sighed heavily because she knew that there was a huge gap between them. She did not understand why the sword accepted the prince, because she knew that he had no taste at all. She knew she had to awaken the sword as soon as possible and make it her own before the crown prince returned. The knight looked at the prince intently and said that as he had ordered, they had caught the spy who had been transmitting information. The prince looked at the man closely and told his knights that it was very good that they had caught him. He knew that, thanks to the young lady, they had changed their strategy and caught the spy. He was furious because he knew that if it weren't for her, he would probably have lost this battle. He looked at the man with fury and told him to tell immediately who sent him. The man was shaking with fear, bursting into tears. The prince looked at the knights and said that they should take the spy to the basement immediately. He said that they should find out everything they could, but they should not let him die an easy death. He was furious and knew that it did not matter who betrayed him, since he would immediately win this war. The knight looked closely at the young lady and said that they had arrived at the place and she could come out. The young lady slowly looked around. She knew that in the novel, this mountain was a place where there were many monsters, but in reality, it was no different from the others. She walked forward with a smile and told her knight to follow her. The knight looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect this. He remembered how she had mocked him and asked if he was good with a sword. She said with a grin that they would now check who would win. She wanted to know who would win, he or her dog. The young lady looked at him with fury and asked how he dared to kill her dog. She asked him angrily if he had forgotten that he was just a toy for fun. She looked at him with a smirk and said that since he had killed her dog, he would now be her doggy. The young man looked closely at the young lady who was wandering around carefree. He knew that they were alone, and if he killed her, he could just say that it was done by monsters. Leon knew that he could get rid of her forever. He drew his sword from its sheath with lightning speed and pointed it at the young lady. Some time later, the young lady froze in place as she saw a fork in the road. She did not understand why it was there. She was surprised and puzzled at the same time, because she did not know where to go. But a moment later the knight approached her with a sword. She was ready. She let out a surprised cry as he cut off several strands of her hair. She was in shock and didn't understand what had happened. A moment later she froze in shock as she saw the snake on the ground that her knight had killed. She, trembling, asked the knight if the snake had really fallen from her head. He looked at her intently and said that he had destroyed the snake. The young lady looked at her knight and thanked him with a smile for saving her, but in turn, she was sure that he wanted to kill her. The knight sighed heavily and said that he was not protecting her at all. It was simply his duty. He knew that if it weren't for his knight's oath, which forbids him from pointing a sword towards his mistress, he would have killed her. He knew that the day he raised his family to their feet and became the highest knight that day would be her end. The young lady in turn looked closely at the map. She sighed heavily and looked intently. Looking at the map, said that there was no fork in the road. She looked sideways at the knight and asked if he knew where they needed to go. The knight sighed heavily and said that he did not know. She knew that according to the information and the novel, the sword can be awakened using a magic stone. This mountain is a favorite place for adventurers, since most of the monsters have these magic stones on them. She knew that if the adventurers went up the mountain, they could find and return with the jewels. Then they could marry the beauty and become rich. The goal of her expedition is to find a high-level stone and awaken the sword. A moment later she said with a smile that she understood where they needed to go. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really knew the way. A moment later the young lady explained to her knight where they needed to go. The young man looked at her in surprise because he did not believe that she knew the way. She looked at the knight with a smile and said that too many adventurers had gone to the mountain, and if she had been monsters, she would have chosen a more deserted path. She smiled and said that for this reason, if they wanted to find a high-level monster, they had to do everything the other way around and go where there were fewer people. Ophelia, in turn, was tired from the exhausted walk, as they had been walking for half a day already. A moment later she sat down on the ground and, sighing heavily, said that she could not go any further. Looking at the knight, she asked him to rest a little. He looked at her in surprise and asked with a grin if she wanted to find the monster. He said that they hadn't walked that far, but she had already given up. The young lady sighed heavily. She thought that she could find the magic stone by going around the place where there are a lot of people always like in novels, but in the end, nothing happened. She was in shock because she realized that life had slapped her in the face. She knew perfectly well that it was already getting dark, and if they didn't leave the mountain before sunset, everything would become much more dangerous. She wondered if they really would have to give up halfway. The young lady was puzzled, as she knew that she would not be able to awaken the sword. She was in shock because she understood that at a wonderful moment she would be killed, just like it was in the novel. She was in shock because she understood perfectly well that it was very difficult to live several lives. She knew that she could not die until she opened a harem of handsome boys. A moment later she was taken aback, and a brilliant idea came to her mind. She looked closely at the knight and asked how about him waiting where he was. The young man looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what she was talking about. She looked at him with a smile, and holding out all her supplies, said that this should be enough. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was sure it would work. She smiled and said that it was getting dark, which meant that the monsters were starting to hunt, and it was quite possible that they might come for food. With the speed of lightning, she built a trap. She looked at the knight with a smile and said that as soon as the monster falls into the trap, he will appear and finish him off with his sword. The knight looked at the lady skeptically and said that he did not believe it, since everything sounded too simple. A moment later, her young lady heard a noise in the distance. She looked at the knight with a smile and told him to look as something approached their trap. A moment later, the knight rushed towards the monster. The young lady looked after him with a smile and said that the monster was caught and now it was his turn. With lightning speed, the knight struck the monster and it screamed. A moment later, Monster B spat out a magic stone onto the ground. The knight in turn struck him again with lightning speed, and the monster crashed into a huge tree. The young lady in turn was happy and rooting for her knight, as she knew that he was simply amazing. She ran up to him with a smile and said that he was a good boy and that they had gotten the stone. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he was very strong and that he was probably the strongest person in the empire. He looked at her puzzledly but did not answer. The young lady looked at the knight intently and asked for forgiveness, as she had completely forgotten that he did not like her touch. She looked at him intently and asked for forgiveness. The young man froze in shock, wondering if she had just apologized to him. He was shocked because he knew that she had never even shown respect to him before. She looked closely at the stone and slowly picked it up. A moment later, she shook the remaining liquid from the stone. She felt a little disgusted to touch it, but she knew she had no other choice. A moment later, she looked at the beautiful stone they had managed to get with a radiant smile. She was glad that she now had such a magical stone. She stood quietly and looked at the beautiful stone, but suddenly a vine appeared behind her. The knight pushed the young lady away and took her side. He shouted and asked her to be careful. A moment later, he froze in place in pain as a vine grabbed his arm. The young lady was shocked. She screamed and called for her knight. He looked at the young lady with alarm and said that unfortunately he was caught in the devil's vine. He shouted that it was very strong and he could not get out of the bonds. He shouted that she should run away, leaving him. The young lady was shocked. She looked at him intently and asked if he was joking right now. She shouted that they would never leave him and started pulling the pocket away from him. The young man froze in shock, as he didn't expect to hear something like this. He knew that she never cared about the lives of ordinary servants. He saw that she had truly changed. A moment later, a young man approached them and said with a grin that it was a very touching attitude towards the lady for a favor. The young lady turned around in surprise and, looking at the young man, asked who he was. He looked at them intently and said with a grin that they were just thieves. He looked at them and said that if they did not want to die, then he would advise them to give up the stone. The young lady was shocked and shouted that they were not thieves, but that they had received this stone when they defeated the dragon. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked what dragon she was talking about. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she was really talking about his pet now. Ophelia was shocked. She didn't expect to hear something like that. He smiled and said that he guarded the entire mountain, so the entire land belonged to him. He looked at the young lady with a glare and said that no one dared steal anything from under his nose. The lady in turn looked at the young man with fury. A moment later, she said that her father was a duke, and if he would let them go, she would give him as much gold and silver as he asked for. The young man looked at her with a grin and said that he didn't care about such things at all. He looked at her with a grin and said that, however, she was quite interesting. He asked why she didn't stay instead of her knight. Leon looked at the young lady in a hurry and said that she should not listen to him, as he did not need her help at all. The young man looked at her intently and said that it would turn out that her servant did not know what gratitude was, and he would now teach him. With lightning speed, he snapped his fingers and cast magic on the knight. The knight was shocked as he realized that Liana was wrapped around his neck very tightly. The young lady was in shock. She screamed at the young man to stop and not to dare to hurt her knight. She was shocked because she understood that if she hadn't wanted to go to the mountain for the stone, then her knight would not have found himself in such a situation. She simply could not abandon him. The young man looked at the young lady with a grin. But a moment later, he weakened his magic, and the knight in turn breathed a sigh of relief. The young man looked at the young lady with a grin and said that it seemed she wanted to save him. He smiled and said that in that case, he could offer her a game. He looked at the young men and said with a grin that they would both name the person who would remain. He said that if their choice coincided, then he would let them go. He smiled and said that if this did not happen, then they would remain as food for his pet. The young lady thought for a moment and wondered if he was experiencing the way a master and servant understand each other without words. She knew that her knight hated her, which meant he would choose to leave her. She knew that if she agreed with him, they would win. The knight glanced sideways at his mistress. He knew that for her selfishness, she would obviously choose him. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said that they were ready to give an answer. The young man looked at them with a grin and said that he would count to 3 and they should answer at the same time. A moment later, the young men simultaneously replied that they were staying. The young man laughed. He looked at them intently and asked if things were really that bad for them. The young lady was shocked. She looked at her knight and asked why he didn't choose her. She asked if he hated her. Leon looked at the lady and said that he should ask the same question to her. She wondered if he shouldn't have abandoned her as an evil mistress. The young man looked at them intently and with a smile told them to stop arguing, as they had come to an agreement and agreed to the terms of the game. He smiled and said that they both stay. The lady looked at the young man intently and said that one would stay, the other would go, and she would give the stone. She said that he must let her knight go. Leon Z froze from the silk on the spot, since he did not expect to hear such a thing from her. The young man looked at the young lady and said with a grin that she was very interesting. He did not understand why she would protect an ordinary knight. He looked at her intently and asked if he was her lover. The young people shouted in unison that this was not so. They were shocked by such a question. Ophelia looked intently at the young man and said, "It makes no difference whether a person is a nobleman or a servant." Leon Z froze in shock, as he didn't expect to hear something like that from her. The young man looked at her intently and said with a grin that it was very interesting. He smiled and said that he would not scare the children anymore, and now he was putting them down. A moment later, he snapped his fingers and released the knight from the vine's death grip. And she looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really letting them go. She was surprised and did not understand why he was doing something like that. He smiled and asked if she wanted to stay for dinner. She was surprised and said with lightning speed that this was not at all true. The young lady quickly grabbed her knight by the hand and said that it was time for them to leave. The young man froze in place, in shock. But the young lady in turn insisted, and with the speed of lightning moved to run away. She looked sideways at her knight and said that it was time for them to leave before the young man changed his mind. A moment later, the young man shouted and said that they should stop. Ophelia sighed heavily as she realized that he had certainly changed his mind. The young man looked at her intently and said that he had something for her. She froze in place from the silk, as she did not expect such a thing. He looked at her intently and said in all seriousness that the truth would soon pierce the heavens and become a ball that would kill the impostor. The young lady froze in shock as she realized what he was talking about. Sometime later in the manor, the young lady stared at her new sword. She remembered the words the stranger had said to her. She was a little puzzled and wondered what his words meant. She remembered what he had said about the impostor. She wondered if he knew she was not the real Ophelia. She knew that there was a man who was able to control monsters and told a prophecy. She knew a man who in the novel fit these characteristics. She knew that the most powerful wizard on the continent was a mysterious being that no one could control. She knew that this person was a royal prophet named Kun. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that the Duke was looking for her. She agreed and said that she would come to the meeting soon. The young lady walked slowly into the room and greeted her father politely. The Duke looked closely at his daughter and said with a smile that she had arrived and now was the time to introduce the guest. The young lady in turn froze in surprise. She looked intently at the young man she had recently met. She was shocked and wondered what he was doing in her house. The young man looked at her intently and said with a grin that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The Duke looked closely at the young people and asked with a smile if they knew each other. The young man smiled and said that it happened, and they met. He looked at the young lady and asked if she would like to tell him what had happened. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer, as she knew that karma had caught up with her. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and said with a smile that he would like to introduce her to the royal prophet, Mr. Kun. He smiled and said that the prophet would be staying with them for a while, so she should take care of him. The young lady, in turn, was shocked as she did not expect such a thing. Ophelia wondered if the dangerous guy would really live under the same roof with her. In turn, the young lady P protested, as she did not want him to stay with them. She was in shock because she knew that just today, he almost killed her and her knight. She wondered if he decided to come to her to get even with her. The young lady looked at the prophet intently and told her father that he was a terrible man, and her father should not allow strangers to live in their house. She was shocked and furious. The young lady looked at him intently and wondered if he didn't have his own home. She didn't understand why he had to live with them. She knew he was up to something. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and said that she should not be rude. He said that her mother had received a gift from Mr. P before she died, so they should do their best for him. Kun looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that it was correct since he had his own goals. He asked the young lady if she wanted to know more about them. She was shocked and screamed that she was not listening to him because she knew it was dangerous to deal with him. He looked at her closely and asked with a smirk, what if he said it was related to her mother's last request? The young lady in turn froze in place in surprise. She did not expect to hear such a thing. She knew that after this affair, Ophelia R. was born prematurely, and her mother died shortly after giving birth. She thought for a moment and wondered what the Duchess might have asked him to do before she died. The young man sighed heavily and said that she really didn't seem interested. A moment later, the young lady stopped him and said that she would like to hear it. For a moment he thought and asked her what to do now, since he didn't want to talk about it at all yet. The young lady was furious. She looked at him closely and realized that he was just a scoundrel. He smiled and, looking at the young lady, said that he would live in their house because her mother wanted it. He smiled and said that whether he would say anything about her mother's request or not, it depended on how she would behave. The young lady was furious as she realized that he was just a cunning fox. She looked at him with anger in her eyes as he was infuriating her. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and said that the crown prince would soon return victoriously back to the kingdom. He said that he would be in charge of organizing the celebration, so she should take care of their guest. The young lady looked at her father in surprise and asked if the crown prince had won. The Duke said with a smile that it was true, since the crown prince had caught the traitor and successfully suppressed the conflict at the border and destroyed the enemy. He looked at his daughter with a smile and said that within 10 days he would return to the capital. The young lady was very happy about the news. She learned that if the prince won, it meant that the plot had changed dramatically. She was happy because she understood that she could change her fate and not die. A few days later, the young lady was sitting and drinking tea on the street. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said that she had brought Master Lao for her. The young man looked at his mistress in surprise and said that he was currently training. He did not understand why she had urgently called him. She looked at the knight intently and said that she had put a magic stone into the sword, and he should see it. The young man looked at the sword in surprise and said that it had become sharper. She said with a smile that everything was correct, and it was all thanks to the high-level stone. She looked at the young man and said that from now on he would be the owner of this sword. She was glad because she understood that she would finally be able to change the owner of the sword and not worry that the crown prince would kill her with it. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to give it to him. Ophelia looked at the knight with a smile and said that everything was correct since it was time to replace his old sword before it fell apart. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked why she suddenly decided to give it to him. He knew that he should not agree so quickly. He understood perfectly well that his mistress had something in mind. She looked at him closely and said that he was the knight who was responsible for her protection. She looked at him closely and asked if he shouldn't have a good sword. Ophelia sighed heavily and said that she knew very well that a lot had happened before, and she had not expected him to suddenly change his mind about her, but she promised that she would respect him in the future. She looked at him intently and said that she would wait until he recognized her and became her true knight. The young man froze in surprise. He could not utter a word. The young lady looked at him intently and asked him to accept the sword with a smile. She said that she knew from the very beginning that it was meant for him. The young man slowly reached for the weapon, but a moment later he froze. For a moment, he hesitated, not knowing what to do. But a few minutes later, he finally decided to take the sword. He turned away from the young lady and sighed heavily. A moment later, he said that he very much hoped that her words today were not another plot. As he left, he said that it was time for him to return to training. The young lady looked at him with a smile on her face. She was glad that he accepted her gift. She noticed that he was shy. She understood perfectly well that sooner or later he would become hers. The prophet looked at the young lady intently and asked her in surprise why she had given away such a valuable sword. He asked if she could not have kept it for herself. The young lady sighed. She was surprised, and he frightened her. Taking her gaze away from him, she said that it was none of his business. The prophet looked at the young lady and said with a grin that although he had passed from one hand to another, he was still dangerous. He asked with a grin if she was not afraid that in the end he would kill her. The young lady froze in shock. She didn't expect to hear something like that from him. In a trembling voice, she said that she didn't understand what he was talking about. As she left, she said that he should stand where he was. She turned around and looked at him intently. The young lady was shocked. She looked at the prophet intently and asked why he dressed like that in her house. The young man looked at her with a smirk and asked if this outfit really turned her on. He slowly walked closer to her and said with a smile that he wouldn't mind marrying her. The young lady was shocked by this statement, but shouted that she didn't need him at all. The young lady, in turn, decided to leave him in a hurry. As she left, she said that he should not follow her. The prophet looked closely at the young lady. He thought she was very funny, as she was not afraid of the sword, but was afraid of his gaze. He sighed heavily, and looking after her, said that, unfortunately, he did not see her future. The young lady looked at the maid with a smile and asked what she looked like. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with admiration that she looked simply stunning. Ophelia thought for a moment and said that however she felt, as if something was missing. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she had any other wishes. A moment later, the young lady said she understood everything. She looked hard at her maid, and a moment later grabbed her hand and told her that she must follow her. The maid looked at her mistress in surprise and asked if this was really possible. Ophelia looked at the maid with a smile and asked what was wrong. She said that if she looked smart, then she should not give a reason to shame her own maid. The young lady looked closely at the maid and said that the color and outfit suited her very well. The maid was surprised and did not expect this. A moment later, she thanked the mistress with a smile. She was a little excited and said that she was an ordinary girl, and since the mistress allowed her to wear these outfits, she could not put up with it. The young lady looked at her intently and said that this was not so, as every girl had the right to be beautiful. Ophelia looked at her maid with a smile and said that they were going to a celebration, and for a maid, she looked very sloppy, and this could affect her image. Ur looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she would not disgrace her under any circumstances. Some time later, they went out into the city for a celebration. The young lady, in turn, noticed that everyone was very happy about the return of the crown prince. She saw that her father had done his best. She looked closely at the prophet and saw that he winked at her. She was puzzled and did not understand why he went with them. A moment later, the young ladies became very excited as they noticed that His Majesty and the knights had entered the city. One of the ladies accidentally pushed Aophelia. Aophelia was shocked because she realized that she was now in a crowd of fans of the Crown Prince. She was puzzled because she realized that the prince had too many fans. It seemed to her that he was a star and everyone present was his fans. The young ladies pushed each other as they wanted to see the Crown Prince as soon as possible. And while chasing the prince, the young lady accidentally pushed Lao. Due to the young lady pushing the knight, he accidentally fell on the prophet. The prophet in turn froze in place from shock. A moment later, everything fell into place, and they parted ways. The young people felt very awkward about the situation. The young lady in turn turned around and told her maid to hold on tight. She did not want the crowd to separate them. But a moment later, the young lady froze in place, in shock, as she realized that her maid had disappeared along with her brother. She was in shock as she realized that her maid had simply been carried away by the crowd. A moment later, she began to search the crowd for her maid, but all was in vain. Kalia heard that the young lady was looking for her maid. She was surprised and did not expect her to come to the event. Kalia was furious because she knew that the young lady was like sticky candy. She was so tightly stuck to the Crown Prince that they couldn't tear her away. A moment later, the Crown Prince returned to the city. Everyone was surprised and happy to see him. He was shining with beauty, and everyone called out to greet him. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily. Since this whole affair did not suit her and did not bring her any pleasure, she wanted to find her maid as soon as possible. The young lady, in turn, turned around and walked in the opposite direction in order to find her maid as quickly as possible. But a moment later, unexpectedly for her, someone pushed her. She was shocked because she realized that she couldn't stand on her feet. The young lady flew with a crash right under the Crown Prince's horse. The Crown Prince was shocked. He didn't expect to see anything like this. He screamed and called out to the young lady. A moment later, he shouted and told her to be careful, and with lightning speed he pulled his horse by the reins. Unexpectedly for everyone, the second prince rushed towards the young lady. He pushed the young lady away with lightning speed so that she would not get run over by the horse. The young lady, in turn, froze in place in surprise and shock as the prince embraced her. She was very scared and did not understand who had caught her. The prince looked at her intently and asked if she was okay. She froze in shock and, without raising her gaze, trembling, said that she was okay. But a moment later she was taken aback as she saw who was in front of her. The Crown Prince looked at his brother with fury and called out to him. Kalia, in turn, was furious because she had succeeded in disgracing the young lady in front of everyone. But she did not at all think that the second prince would help her and save her. Kalia knew very well that if His Highness the Crown Prince saw the young lady flirting with another man, it would be even better. She looked closely at the prince and noticed that he was definitely angry. She was glad because she understood that she had won in this situation, since her Naledi kept saying that she loved the Crown Prince, and now she was flirting with another. The Crown Prince looked at the young lady with anger. He had previously thought that she had been sincere with him. The prince understood perfectly well that in fact this place could be occupied not only by him, but also by his brother. Ophelia Z froze in place from shock as she felt as if someone was drilling her back with a chilling gaze. The knight looked at the Crown Prince and said that he still had to meet with the Emperor. He said that if they lingered here any longer they would be late. The Crown Prince looked at the young men with fury and told them to immediately step aside as they were blocking his way. The young lady, in turn, hastily asked the prince for forgiveness. She looked at the prince intently and asked for forgiveness. She said that she would be more careful in the future. The Crown Prince glanced sideways at the young lady but said nothing. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what was wrong with his face. She wondered if it was because she had fallen and crossed his path. She looked at him closely and wondered if he was being too petty. Deuces, in turn, looked intently after his brother Deuces. with a grin, looked after his brother because he knew that the play was just beginning. He wanted to take everything from his brother. The young lady looked at the young man intently and thanked him for his help. He smiled and said that she didn't need to thank him at all. A moment later, he smiled and said that if she really wanted to thank him for saving her, she could take her time to go for a walk with him. He smiled and said that he would like her to help him choose a gift for the girl. Ophelia looked at the prince intently and asked for forgiveness. She said that she had become separated from the maid, and if she did not find her, she would be very worried. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that the young man was the one who framed the crown prince, but his plot fortunately failed. She understood perfectly well that if the crown prince found out the truth about who actually framed him, he would be in trouble. She knew perfectly well that for her own safety, she needed to stay as far away from him as possible. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she could help him, if he helped her find a maid. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if she could bother him with such trifles. She was shocked and wanted him to just leave her alone. The young man sighed heavily and said with a sad expression that he thought they were friends. He asked if she was so polite and distant because she hated him. The young lady was shocked. She shouted that it was not so, and he had simply misunderstood her. She was surprised and confused, as she did not know what to do. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she would agree to go to the party with him in that case. He smiled and said that she did not need to worry, as he would send knights to find her maid and send her to them. Ophelia was shocked, as she realized that, as expected, it was impossible to simply refuse the two-faced villain. The emperor looked closely at his son and said with a smile that he had indeed not disappointed him. He smiled and said that he had heard that his son had captured a traitor. The crown prince bowed and said that it was exactly like that. The emperor looked at him intently and asked if he recognized whose handiwork this was. The crown prince, in turn, froze in place. He did not know what to answer. The prince looked at the spy with anger and asked if he would continue to remain silent. He was furious and wanted to find out as quickly as possible who had ordered him to convey their plan to the enemy. The man was trembling with fear and said that the second prince had ordered him to do this. The crown prince was furious. He shouted that this was complete nonsense. A moment later, he ordered his knights to lock up the spy and then execute him. The man was in shock. He shouted to the prince that it was not so, and he told the truth. He begged for mercy. The crown prince sighed heavily and, looking at the emperor, said that unfortunately they were unable to extract the name of the traitor. The emperor looked at his son closely and said with a smile that this time he had achieved great success. He asked his son if he wanted a worthy reward for his success. A moment later, the crown prince froze in place. He remembered how he said goodbye to the young lady. He said that she should promise that when he returned victorious, she would do something for him. The emperor looked at his son closely and said with a smile that he had heard that he had a good relationship with the duke's daughter. He knew that not only had she given them battle advice, but his son had also accepted her gift before leaving. The emperor said that the duke's daughter had a marriage contract with the marquis, but if his son liked her, he would do everything necessary to ensure that they were together. The crown prince looked at his father intently and said that he did not want anything. He thought for a moment because he knew that the girl had spoken to him about love, but he himself saw that she had incomprehensible relationships with other men. The crown prince looked at his father intently and said sullenly that he did not love the young lady. He knew very well that he did not need her at all. Ophelia, in turn, sneezed involuntarily. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked if she had caught a cold. She smiled and said that it was not that simple. Someone was quietly saying nasty things about her behind her back. Sometime later, the store consultant brought the most popular options that they had in the store. She looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she had fair skin, so any set would suit her. Ophelia was sad and said with a smile that it was not so. Since the gift would not be for her, she knew that she was simply forced to help. The young lady looked at the prince, intently wondering who he was going to give the gift to. The prince looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile what she liked best of all. He sighed heavily and said that, frankly speaking, he did not understand the preferences of ladies. The young lady thought for a moment and thought that something simpler would be appropriate for Kalia. She looked at all the options carefully for a while, and a few minutes later, she said that this set would work very well for pink hair. The prince, in turn, looked at the young lady with bewilderment, as he did not expect her to say something like that. A moment later, he asked with a smile if she knew who the gift was going to be for. The young lady said with a smile that she already had an idea of who he would give the gift to. She knew that he would only give this set to the main character. He looked at her closely and asked with a smile if she wanted to try on the set. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected to hear such a thing. She was shocked, as she had already resigned herself to going with him, but she was surprised that he wanted her to act as a model. She sighed heavily because she knew that she was here now simply to help him. She understood that she needed to treat this request as a favor. Some time later, the young lady tried on the set. The prince approached her and said with a smile that he would like to help her. She smiled and said that he shouldn't do that at all. He looked at her closely and noticed that she was a very shy lady, but a moment later she finally agreed with him. The prince looked at her closely. With a smirk on his face, he saw that her neck was so thin that it seemed as if it could break from one touch. The young lady looked at her reflection in surprise. She was amazed by the beauty of this set. Now she realized that it was not for nothing that jewelry stores make so much money, because it was simply impossible to resist this decoration. The prince looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that it suited her very well. She smiled and said that she was talking about jewelry now. He walked up to her and took her hand with a smile, after which he tenderly kissed her hand and said that he was talking about her. The young lady froze in place from the silk, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The prince looked at her intently and with a sly smile said that she was very beautiful. Ophelia was in shock. She didn't expect to hear something like that from him. Her head almost exploded from embarrassment. The prince looked at the girl and with a smile said that they would take this jewelry, but it would remain on the young lady. He also asked the girl to send the bill to the palace. The girl was very surprised and happy. She thanked the prince with a smile for the wonderful purchase. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock. She did not understand what was happening at all. The prince looked at her intently and said with a smile that he really hoped that she liked this set. She looked at him in surprise and asked if this gift was really for her. She was surprised and did not expect this, as she thought that he was going to give this set to the main character. The prince looked at the young lady with a sly smile and said that everything was correct, and he decided to give her a gift. Ophelia was in shock because she knew she was not the main character. She looked closely at the prince and asked why he suddenly decided to give her such a gift. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it was all because he wanted to court her. The maid looked at her mistress intently and said excitedly that she was very frightened when she learned that her mistress had left with the second prince. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily, but did not answer. The maid looked at her mistress in surprise and called her. She saw that her mistress was agitated by something. Ophelia looked at Ur in surprise, since she was not listening to her at all. A moment later, she said that the prince had really helped her out a lot. The maid looked at her mistress in surprise and asked what had happened to her, since after her return, she had not looked like herself at all. The young lady looked at the maid intently and said that she had a very serious question for her. Ur looked at her mistress in bewilderment, as she did not understand what she wanted to ask. The young lady looked at the maid with embarrassment and asked if a man had ever confessed his feelings to her. The maid, in turn, froze in place from embarrassment and shock. She did not expect to hear such a question at all. A moment later, the maid looked at her mistress with confusion and said excitedly that it was too early. She asked her mistress what she was talking about. Ophelia thought for a moment as she realized that she had asked the wrong person such a sensitive question. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if the prince had confessed his love to her. The young lady looked at the maid with a worried and puzzled expression and asked how she knew about this. The maid smiled and, looking at her mistress, said that it was all because since she had returned from their meeting, she had been looking at the prince's gift all the time and sighing. The young lady in turn sighed heavily, as she understood perfectly well that everything was exactly like that. The prince looked at her intently and said with a smile that she could take her time with her answer. He smiled and said that he still very much hoped that she would give him a chance. The young lady was shocked, as she understood perfectly well that she knew him too well, and in the original, he used any methods to achieve his goals. She sighed heavily because she understood perfectly well that even though he was handsome, he still needed to be avoided at all costs. Yor looked at the lady and asked if she was worried that she couldn't choose between the two princes. Ophelia sighed and thoughtfully said that it wasn't that. The maid smiled and said that according to her findings, her mistress loved the crown prince very much, but she was surprised because she understood that the second prince also liked her mistress. Yor said with a playful smile that this was very wonderful, since she was currently in a love triangle. She looked intently at the lady and asked with a smile whom she would choose. To find out whom the lady would choose, the one who loves her or the one whom she loves. Yor smiled and said that her mother once said that if you choose the one who loves you, then your life will be happier. She smiled and looked at the lady and said that she and the second prince would look very handsome at the wedding, and they were just the perfect couple. Ophelia sighed heavily in turn. She was surprised, as she did not expect such a thing from the maid. She understood perfectly well that no matter which of the brothers she chose to take part of the empire, she would still grab it. She understood perfectly well that before getting into her grief, she had to get into their pond. She understood perfectly well that of all the young men, her little jackdaw was the best, because he was only hers. Ophelia sighed heavily and closed the gift from the prince. She said that she had only recently broken up with a nobody, so love matters. She had no desire to marry just anyone. Ophelia did not understand why she had to choose. She just wanted to open a harem. The young lady thought for a moment and said that she heard the prince talking about the princess's upcoming birthday. She said that they needed to prepare a suitable gift for her. Gwen Ilter, the young princess, 8 years old. She was the youngest princess of the empire and the beloved sister of the crown prince. Ophelia's maid, Ophelia's gift for the princess, and replaced it with a beetle. Subsequently, the young lady ruined the party and was accused. The emperor was furious and forbade the young lady to appear at any noble events. She understood that such an outcome was inevitable. The young lady said that she was not guilty and that she was set up, but it was all in vain. She understood perfectly well that her maid was angry with her because of the previous incident, and keeping such a maid near her was too dangerous. She understood perfectly well that she needed to deal with it as soon as possible, before the thorn turned into a dagger. That same evening, the prince sat quietly and enjoyed his tea while reading a book. A moment later, the crown prince came to visit his brother. Ducis looked at the crown prince in surprise, as he did not expect to see him. He looked at the prince with a grin and asked why he had come to see him so late in the evening. The crown prince sighed heavily and said that he had come during the day, but he was not there. The prince smiled and asked his brother's forgiveness, as he had been out walking with a young lady that day. He said with a smile that he had been so happy with their walk that he had completely forgotten about the time. The crown prince looked at his brother in surprise and asked if they were really dating. Ducis looked intently at his brother and said with a smile that, not yet, but he had already confessed his feelings to her, and she said that she would think about his words. Reynolds, in turn, wondered what the young lady would be thinking. He understood perfectly well that if she really liked him, she would have immediately refused Ducis. The prince looked closely at his brother and asked with a grin what was wrong with his face. A moment later, the crown prince told his brother that he had won the battle and returned. He looked closely at his brother and asked if he had anything he wanted to tell him. Ducis looked at his brother with a smile and said that he congratulated him on his victory, since he believed in him all this time. Reynolds looked at his brother in surprise and asked if that was really how it was. He said that sometimes he thought that his brother was waiting for him to fail. Ducis looked at his brother with a smile and asked how he had helped. He smiled and said that his father had valued his brother since childhood, so he would definitely win. The crown prince looked at his brother with fury and asked if he had anything else to say. Reynolds was furious and did not understand why his brother had betrayed him. The prince looked at his brother closely and asked him with a grin what he wanted to hear. He smiled and said that if it was about the young lady, then he was aware of the rumors about her love for the prince. He smiled and said that, however, they were not in a relationship yet. For this reason, they were now in fair competition. Ducis looked at his brother with a smile and said that he was not so greedy that he could not tolerate a competitor. Reynolds sighed heavily and said that it was time for him to go. As he left, the crown prince glanced sideways at his brother and told him to stop talking about that girl in front of him, as he didn't care. The young man looked at his brother with a smile because he understood that everything was not right. He looked after him with a smirk because he knew very well that in the past, his brother had always been hypocritical with him, and today he had finally taken off his mask. He understood perfectly well that his rapprochement with the young lady and stubbornness had hurt him. Now Ducis P realized that the young lady was not indifferent to his brother. Some time later, the young lady was sitting quietly on the terrace and preparing a gift for the princess. The prophet slowly approached her and looked at her with a smile. He asked if she was preparing a gift for the princess. He was surprised because he saw that she had a useless piece of paper and a couple of dead flowers in her hands. The young lady was furious. She said that what he listed was called a greeting card. She said that she didn't have dead flowers, but dried ones. Kun looked at her in surprise and asked if she had prepared a greeting card. He smiled and said that this was something new, since he had never heard of anything like this before. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she would like to explain what she was doing. She sighed heavily and said that it could not be explained in words. She smiled and said that she was just folding paper and flowers. The prophet watched the young lady closely and attentively. A moment later, the young lady looked at the beautiful finished work. The prophet looked at the young lady in surprise and said with a smile that it was the first time he saw something like this, since no master in the empire had ever done such a thing. The young lady looked at him intently and knew that of course he could not see such a thing since modern people had invented it. Kun looked closely at the young lady and, approaching her, asked where she learned this. He smiled and asked if she had learned this in her world. The young lady looked at him with a smile but did not answer. Ophelia knew that if she couldn't answer a question, she could just pretend she didn't hear it. Kun looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that she could rest, assured that he would not expose her. He would just wait for the surprise that she would give him. He smiled and asked her not to give him a ride. The young lady was shocked. She wondered when he would move out from them. The young lady sighed heavily and, looking at the card, said that it looked very beautiful, but it just lacked beautiful music. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really needed music. She looked at the young man intently and said that she would like to hear beautiful music when opening the postcard. Kun looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was talking about magic now, and it was very easy to do. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if he could really do something like that. He looked closely at the young lady with a smile on his face. He also noticed that she took his hand tenderly. He gently touched her face and said with a smile that she should not forget that he was the strongest magician in the empire, and he had no equal. The young lady looked at him intently, as she knew that he could do anything she asked him to do with magic. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that her face changed very quickly. He said with a smile that she could tell him what he needed to do. She looked at him intently, and with a playful smile began to say what she wanted. But suddenly the maid called her. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that His Highness had arrived to see her. Ophelia looked at the maid in surprise, as she did not expect the crown prince to come to her. The prince sat quietly in the room, waiting for the young lady. He stared at the handkerchief she had given him before leaving. Ophelia entered the living room and looked at the crown prince in surprise. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise, but did not answer. Ophelia said that unfortunately she did not know that he was coming to see her, so for this reason she did not meet him. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that he had not changed his mind, so the fault was his. Ophelia looked at him intently and asked if the prince had any business with her. The ice prince looked away from the young lady and asked if she was hurt when she fell during the celebration. She looked at him in surprise and said with a smile that she was fine, since fortunately the second prince had arrived in time. The prince inherited and was furious when he heard about his brother. A moment later, he said that even if his brother had not been there, he would have stopped the horse in time. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She did not hear what he said, but she hoped it was not something important. Reynolds sighed heavily and said he had said nothing. A moment later, he looked sharply at the young lady and said he had come to her today for a promise. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her closely and asked if she remembered this thing. He showed her the scarf that she had given him. The young lady was shocked because she realized that he now had, in his hands, the handkerchief that she had given him. She remembered all his words. Ophelia looked at the prince intently and asked what he wanted her to do. Ophelia sighed heavily and said that she wanted to tell him right away that she would not kill anyone or set anything on fire. She looked closely at the prince and said that his wish should be within her power. He looked at the young lady with a smirk on his face. He asked in surprise if she really thought that with her body, she was capable of killing someone. The young lady was furious because she saw that he was looking down on her. The prince smiled and said that she did not need to worry about such things. He came closer to her and with a smirk, looking into her eyes, said that she was able to do whatever he asked. The young lady in turn froze in place from surprise and embarrassment as the prince was too close to her face. He slowly leaned closer to her and quietly said that he wanted her to be his partner for the princess's birthday celebrations. He looked closely at the young lady, waiting for her positive answer. She froze in shock, unsure of what to say, as she filtered through all the information. She looked at him in surprise and asked if that was all he wanted from her. The prince looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked what else he could ask her for. He asked with a grin if she really wanted him to marry her. The young lady in turn looked away in embarrassment and said that she had not thought of anything like that. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she had made a huge contribution to the victory over the empire. He smiled and said that it was not even a request, but rather a reward. The young lady was shocked and wondered what he was even saying. She wanted to know if he understood what he had just said. The young lady was in shock as she understood perfectly well that if she were his partner for the holidays, all the ladies would tear her to pieces. She looked at him intently and asked if he was joking. She couldn't understand how he came up with such a reward. She sighed heavily as she understood perfectly well that the crown prince should learn from his brother, since his reward was in gold and precious stones. The crown prince looked at the young lady intently and said that as far as he knew, her image had taken a hit due to her breakup with her boyfriend. She knew very well that if he hadn't been there, this simply wouldn't have happened. Reynolds said that the young man publicly broke off the engagement by making him a witness, and the nobles secretly laugh at the young lady and belittle her family. The young lady thought for a moment, as she knew full well that it was she who had blackened the name of her family. He looked at her closely and said that if she wanted to save the situation, people had to think of her differently. The prince said that while she was with him at the celebration, not a single soul would dare point a finger at her or say nasty things. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and asked if he was really serious now. She understood perfectly well that he wanted to show in public that they were a couple. He looked at her intently and said that, of course, he was serious now, but that did not mean that he liked her. He sighed heavily and said that it was the other way around, and he could not stand her. The young lady in turn understood everything perfectly, but she was not even surprised after his words. He sighed heavily and said that this was the purpose of his visit to her, and he also gave her a gift that she would give to the princess. He said that he knew better about his sister's preferences. He looked closely at the young lady and said that if she won the favor of his sister, then she would be recognized by the highest power, because his father's favorite was the princess. A moment later, he said that they were finished and it was time for him to leave. The young lady, in turn, asked for forgiveness and detained the prince. She slowly walked closer to him and thanked him with a smile for his kindness. She looked at him intently and asked for forgiveness. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She smiled and said that his plan was just perfect. She said that if she was his companion, it would really help her improve her reputation among the nobility. However, she understood perfectly well that she had her own views on this matter, and she wanted to discuss everything with him. She looked at the prince intently and said that if her reputation required sacrificing others, she would refuse. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing from her. He thought about it and said that he was the crown prince, and no one dared to discuss his actions. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she did not want to use him for such vile purposes. He was too noble to worry about her. Ophelia looked at him intently and said that besides a fake relationship would not last long, even if he helped her for a while. She asked him what would happen next. She said that when he found a partner, he would leave her and she would become a laughing stock. She looked at the crown prince and said that lying would not help her for long. The prince froze in surprise as he looked at the young lady. He looked at her closely as he realized that he had truly underestimated her. He was surprised that she had thought so much about this in advance. He looked at her intently and said in all seriousness that this was her opinion, and he respected it. He looked at her intently and asked if she didn't want to have anything to do with him because of his brother. The young lady was shocked. She looked closely at the prince and asked what his brother had to do with it. The prince looked at the young lady with fury. She was surprised because she understood that they had gone in the wrong direction. He looked at her intently and asked if they hadn't then gone out to joyfully celebrate his return. The prince said, young lady, that his brother had even confessed his feelings to her. She was surprised and looking at the prince asked how he knew about this. He looked at her closely, asking if she thought his brother would get it all wrong, and that was why she didn't let him get too close. Ophelia was in shock. She shouted that everything was wrong. She didn't understand why he was thinking about such a thing. The young lady was furious. She didn't know how to explain everything to the crown prince. With the speed of lightning, the crown prince took the young lady's hand and pulled her closer to him. He looked at her hard and said that she should stay as far away from his brother as possible. He said that she could choose anyone, but not him. She looked at him intently and said that even if he said so, she simply couldn't not communicate with him. She was shocked and raised the question that the pairing with the villain would be too short. He looked at her intently and asked if she was sure about it. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and said that of course she was sure. The crown prince looked at the young lady with a smile on his face and said, I agree with her. But even though she refused to spend time together, she still needs to accept the gift. He said with a smile that making his sister happy was still her top priority. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and agreed with him. In turn, the prince continued to listen to her attentively. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise, as they had already finished their conversation. She wondered when he would leave. He looked at her intently and asked if she didn't want to know what he would give her. She was shocked and didn't understand why he was jumping from topic to topic when she had already clearly hinted to him that it was time for him to leave. She looked timidly at the prince and asked what he wanted to give her. The prince was shocked. He sighed heavily and said that he was now taking his words back since she was completely hopeless. He looked at the young lady and said that she must remember what the princess loves. He looked at her intently. While coming closer to her, the prince said that more than anything in the world his sister loves desserts. The young lady looked intently at the delicious table in front of her. She was going to give the cake to her princess for her birthday. She looked at everyone gathered and said that for that reason, she would like to hear a little from each of them. Tian looked closely at the entire exquisite table and said with a smile that everything looked very appetizing. The young lady looked at them intently and said with a smile that she had done it all herself. She smiled and said that she really hoped that everyone would find something to their taste. The knight looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she had done it all herself. He looked at her intently and said in surprise that as far as he remembered, she had never been in the kitchen. He didn't understand how she could do something like that. The young lady was taken aback as she realized that she had made a huge mistake. She smiled and said that when she was last visiting the prince, she tried many peanut desserts, and before leaving, she asked for recipes. Of course, she knew that it was not as easy as you were in your past life. Her mother opened her own pastry shop, so she taught her how to bake cakes since she was a child. Tian Shi asked the young lady if she really learned how to bake delicious desserts from the recipe. He smiled and said that it was simply amazing. Yor looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that this was simply wonderful. The prophet in turn looked at the young lady with a smile, but said nothing. Ophelia looked at the prophet intently, for she knew what he was thinking about now. Ophelia slowly approached her friend and offered him an exquisite dessert with a smile. She knew that the young man and the princess were about the same age, so their tastes should coincide. She understood perfectly well that his opinion would be the most important. He looked closely at the young lady and thanked her with a smile on his face. Ophelia looked at the young man with a smile. She wanted to know his opinion about dessert. A moment later, the young man burst into tears in front of everyone. He cried and said that her dessert was very tasty. She looked at him in surprise because she didn't understand why he was crying if he was enjoying it. He sighed heavily and said that he simply remembered that he used to live in hunger, and now a young lady has taken him in to be raised, and he also eats the cake that she made. The young lady looked at him with a smile and said that he was exaggerating now, since it was just a dessert. A moment later, he sadly said that it would be great if his friends could try the delicacies prepared by the young lady. Yor looked at her brother in surprise and said that he shouldn't say such a thing. A moment later, the maid looked at the young lady and said that he was very lucky that he was able to answer her dessert. She said that he wasn't trying to dictate at all. She looked at the lady intently and said that for ordinary people like them, sweets are a luxury, and they in turn are very grateful that the young lady decided to share desserts with them. Ophelia knew very well that in this world, skilled pastry chefs would either be sent straight to the palace or hired by the families. In addition, the nobles had access to rare ingredients that the commoners did not. She knew that even ordinary shops and cheese desserts were not at all something that the lower classes could afford. She understood perfectly well that if she opened a shop selling cheap and tasty desserts, she would be able to treat common people with them. A moment later, she looked at everyone present with a smile and asked them to try the delicious desserts. The young people in turn enjoyed exquisite desserts. Suddenly, their gazes met, but they turned away from each other with lightning speed. Kalia looked closely at the maid, since she in turn came to her with a denunciation. Kalia looked at her closely and asked if the young lady was really going to bake the princess cake herself. The maid bowed obediently and told the young lady that it was exactly like that. Kalia thought for a moment and said that she had already invited the most famous pastry chef in the empire. She understood perfectly well that Ophelia would be disgraced in front of everyone at the celebration. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said that she would certainly do everything she ordered. She looked at her mistress intently and said that she had promised her something before Kalia said that of course she remembered her words. However, if she wanted to become her servant, she had to do something else. She looked intently at the maid and said that this item should be given as a gift to Aophelia. The maid looked warily at the small box and asked what was in it. The young lady looked at the maid with a smile and said that there was just a cute bug. She said that if Aophelia gave the princess a wormy cake, she would be a laughing stock in the evening, and she would also be punished by the emperor. The young lady said with a smirk that then she would never be able to get close to the crown prince again. The maid was frightened. She looked closely at the young lady and asked what would happen if she was caught. Kalia looked at the maid and said that in that case she would be unworthy of working for her family. She looked at her and said that this was her and only attempt. The maid was surprised, but a moment later her expression changed, and she looked at the young lady with a fierce grin. She said that she would not let her down. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she was beautiful today and that she would be the most dazzling of all at today's celebration. The young lady said with a smile that she would probably decline it, as she could not take the princess's attention away. Kun looked at the young lady closely and said with a smirk that he didn't expect that from her. He looked at her intently with a smile on his face and called her. She looked at him sideways and said that this was called knowing your strengths and weaknesses. A moment later, a maid entered their room and said that she had brought them some cake. The maid slowly placed the cake on the table. Everyone looked at her intently. Yor looked at the dessert with a smile and said that it looked very appetizing, and she was sure that the princess would like this cake. Kun looked at the young lady with a smile and said that the card would make her shine. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that the desserts in this world are all small, so there is no such thing as cake. She was sure that she would certainly win the favor of the princess and the emperor. However, first she knew she had to do something. She looked at Rona and said that this was not it. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and said that this was what she wanted to give the princess, and there was no other dessert. The young lady said that she had made the cake herself, so she knew better. She looked closely at the maid and said that she wanted to give the princess something else. The young lady looked coldly at the maid and asked if anyone had touched the gift after she finished it. The maid in turn became tense, but a moment later she changed her expression and said, "That's not right." The maid was very worried and wondered if the young lady had noticed something. She knew perfectly well that if the mistress hadn't noticed anything, she wouldn't have asked. She was well aware that no one had seen her plant the bug and wondered how the young lady could have known about such a thing. Aophelia told Yura that she should bring a knife right now and cut the cake. The maid was shocked. She did not expect anything like this from the young lady. Aophelia looked at the maid intently and said that she had one last chance to confess before they made the cut. The maid looked sideways at the young lady and said that she did not understand at all what was being discussed. Rona knew perfectly well that this dessert was a birthday present for the princess, so Aophelia wouldn't dare ruin it now. The young lady looked at the maid with a smirk and asked if she really didn't want to confess. A moment later she told Yura to cut the dessert. Yor looked intently at the young lady and said that she would definitely do everything. The head maid was shocked. She did not understand what was the point of cutting a birthday present. She thought that the young lady was simply out of her mind. The lady looked closely at the maid and said that if before the beginning, then she must hold on until the end. A moment later, Yor screamed after cutting the cake. She was in shock and screamed that there was a bug in it. The head maid fell on her knees like lightning and, looking at the young lady, asked permission to explain everything. She screamed that she didn't know how he got there either. The young lady looked at the maid with fury and asked her if she didn't know. She asked if she hadn't brought the beetle and put it in the cake. The head maid was in shock. She shouted at the young lady that she was simply set up and that she had nothing to do with it. Aophelia looked at Yor and said that she could speak. Yor looked closely at the young lady and said that, as she asked, she had been watching the head maid from the moment she finished the dessert. She said that she saw the head maid put a bug in the dessert. The young lady looked at the head maid with anger and asked if she had anything to say in her defense. Okay. And looking at the mistress, she asked if she had already suspected her from the beginning. Ophelia looked at the maid intently and asked what Kalia had done, that she had decided to set her up. The maid looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that now she had nothing to hide. She said that Kalia would allow her to work in the Knightleet estate. The young lady looked at the maid intently and asked if she didn't like the Duke's mansion and decided to go to Knightleet. The maid looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that she could stop being a hypocrite. She said that she knew very well that the mistress did not like her, so she would sooner or later be kicked out of the estate. The young lady angrily shouted at the maid that if she had been submissive, she would not have done such a thing. A moment later, the lady shouted to the maid that she was now fired. She called the knights and told them to throw her out. The maid was shocked, as she did not expect this. She finally looked at the young lady with fury. The maid looked at the lady with a smirk and asked what was wrong, since she knew she had won. She shouted that the lady had ruined the princess's gift, which meant she would be disgraced. She said with a smirk that she had accomplished her task. The young lady was shocked. She shouted at the maid that she was simply incorrigible. She looked closely at the knights and told them to tell all the nobles about her actions. Ophelia heard a few minutes ago that the maid wanted to find another place to work. She said that she did not want her to ever work for a nobleman. The knights said that they understood everything and would carry out her order. The maid was shocked. She screamed that the young lady simply would not dare to do this to her. She screamed and in a fit of rage insulted her. Sometime later, the young lady could still hear her screaming and insulting her. Kun looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile what she would do, since he saw that the gift was ruined. He said with a smile that now there was no time to prepare a new gift. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that there was a good saying about always having a backup plan on hand. A moment later, Leon entered the room with a smile and brought the young lady her cake. Ophelia looked at the prophet closely and asked with a smile if he didn't expect her to make 2 desserts. Kalia looked at the young man intently and said with a smile that he must be joking. He smiled and said that he was not, as he was telling her the pure truth. He smiled and told the young lady that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. He smiled and said that he was very flattered that she had agreed to be his partner. The young lady looked at her companion intently and said that she had heard that the Duke's family was putting a spoke in their wheels. She was upset, but looked at him and asked if it was true. He sighed heavily and said with a smile that there had always been clashes between their families and that it had started long before the engagement had broken off. She looked at the young man closely and sighed heavily, as she said that after all, she was partly involved in this, so she was worried. The young lady was furious, as she understood that Ophelia had pushed her out of the spotlight and she would repay her in kind. The Marquis looked at the young lady and said that she should not blame herself at all, since she had nothing to do with the divorce. He said that Ophelia was so jealous and vicious that it was simply unworthy for her to enter his family. He looked at the young lady intently and tenderly, took her hand, after which he kissed it. He said that in his heart, this place will be occupied only by her. The young lady looked at the young man with a smile and said that he was just flattering her. She smiled and said that her father was just a simple count, so she was not worthy of him. She understood perfectly well that the young man could only dream of her. She looked closely at the crown prince, as he was the only one she wanted to marry. She looked closely at her brothers, as she knew perfectly well that she would marry a man who would be of imperial blood. The Marquis looked closely at everyone present and noticed that the young lady was not yet visible. He wondered with a grin if she was afraid to meet him. Kalia, in turn, wondered if the maid had done everything as she had told her. She understood perfectly well that she should not trust everything to a stranger. Since she had a backup plan, she understood perfectly well that the young lady would disappear from high society forever today. The young lady looked at the prophet with a playful smile and said that it was time for them to go. She was glad because she knew that the danger had already passed. The young man looked at her intently and said that she should stop. He took her hand. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand why he behaved in such a way. He said with a smile that she should now follow him right behind. She looked at him in surprise and asked what happened. She knew that they didn't have much time now. A moment later they entered the dressing room. With lightning speed, the prophet pressed the young lady against the wall. He looked at her intently and called out. The young lady in turn froze in shock. On the spot she looked at him intently and asked embarrassedly what he wanted. Kun looked intently at the young lady and in all seriousness said that she should undress now. The young lady in turn froze in embarrassment and shock. She didn't know what to do anymore. He looked at her intently and said that at first he wanted to wait until she did it herself, but he apparently would not wait for that. She looked at him confusedly and asked what happened. The young lady looked at him intently and wondered if he had found out that she had gained a little weight. She wondered if he was going to use magic to remove her extra pounds. A moment later, the young man lightly hit her on the head and said that she seemed to be daydreaming. He looked at her intently and said that her outfit was ruined. Ophelia looked at the prophet in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Some time later, the young lady finally took off her luxurious outfit and froze in surprise, because having cut the outfit, she noticed the coat of arms of the imperial family on it. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and confusion and said that this was too much. She did not understand who needed the young lady to suffer so much. Ophelia was shocked. She said that if someone had seen this at the princess's birthday, she would have immediately ended up behind bars. Kun looked closely at the young lady and said that the outfit was sent from a clothing store and there was no need to look for the culprit. The young lady was shocked. She did not expect at all that Kalia would not only order her gift to be ruined, but also to fuss with the outfit. She knew that the plot had it that Kalia had planted the cake beetle with the help of the maid in order to frame Ophelia, so she kept a close eye on the maid. She was surprised and did not expect that the potassium would ruin her outfit as well. She knew that using the imperial crest without permission was a serious crime. She was puzzled because she knew that this was not mentioned in the book. The young lady was surprised and did not understand why everything was happening this way. She wondered if it was because she helped the crown prince figure out his brother's plan that the plot changed. She sighed heavily and realized that this was very troublesome, but still she knew that she would be better off thinking about it later. She looked at the prophet intently and thanked him, because if he had not prompted her, she would have certainly ended up behind bars. He looked at her with a smile and said that it was all nonsense. The young lady in turn looked at the prophet with alarm and asked how he knew about such a thing. He looked at her with a smile and said that she should not forget that he was the chief prophet of the empire and therefore was able to predict many things. He looked hard at the young lady and said that he should still warn her. He sighed heavily and, looking into the distance, said that the future is predetermined and those who try to change it will be punished by fate. He looked at her intently and asked if she understood him. The young lady in turn froze in surprise. She did not understand what he meant. She wondered if he meant that her future was set. Ophelia didn't know if she should just accept that fact. She was furious because she knew she wouldn't let herself die a cruel death. Leon looked at the young lady intently and said that the banquet was about to begin. A moment later she was taken aback and said that she needed to get ready quickly. She knew that now she could only take small steps towards her goal. Some time later, the young lady along with the prophet arrived at the celebration. Everyone present was shocked, as they did not expect to see her accompanied by the prophet. The ladies were shocked. They were discussing her because they knew that she liked the crown prince. They knew that she was with the second prince at the party recently. They looked at her closely and said that she was just twisting men around as she wanted. She sighed heavily because she knew that she shouldn't have come with him at all. He looked at the young lady with a smile and asked what had happened. He wanted to know if she had fallen for his charm. He smiled and said that his popularity among the ladies was on par with princes. She sighed heavily, and looking at her companion, asked who would compare them. He looked at her intently, and said with a smile that, as long as she was with him, no one would dare to harm her. She sighed heavily, and agreed with him, because she knew it was true. A moment later, the lady froze in place in surprise, as she heard someone calling her. The prince slowly approached her and said with a smile that she had finally arrived. She was surprised because she did not expect him to approach her. The prince looked intently at the prophet and said with a smile that they had not seen each other for a long time. The prophet looked at the prince with a smile on his face. The prince looked at the prophet intently and said that he now understood why the young lady had refused to be his companion. He said that he thought she would simply come with his brother. The young lady in turn laughed, but did not answer. She understood perfectly well that she had no desire to provoke any of them. A moment later, music began to play in the hall. The prince looked closely at the young lady and smiled. The prince looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he did not know whether he would be lucky or not, but he would like to dance her first dance with her. The young lady looked at the prince intently and thanked him with a smile for the invitation. A moment later, Ophelia said with a smile that she had already agreed to the first dance with Mr. Kun. She sighed heavily and said that she was very sorry. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that this time she would not allow herself to be led by the nose as at the holiday. She understood perfectly well that she needed to stay away from the prince. The prince looked at her intently and, sighing heavily, said that it was very sad. A moment later, he wished the young people good luck. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that he would like to talk about the relationship. He smiled and said that he was waiting for her answer. She looked at him with a smile and said that she would definitely give him an answer a little later. She was shocked, as she was so absorbed in preparing for the birthday that she completely forgot about his confession. The prophet looked closely at the young lady and asked with a grin if the prince had confessed his love to her. She sighed heavily and, looking at the young man, asked if he really wanted to laugh now. Kun looked at her with a smile and said that compared to her previous fiancé, the second prince was a better candidate. She looked at him in surprise and bewilderment and asked if he knew about the break in her engagement. She knew that in the book, he was a character who always kept away from people. She was very surprised because it was a surprise to her that he knew about all the gossip. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that, as long as she was interesting to him, he would know everything. She sighed heavily and agreed with him. At the same time, she called him simply stubborn. She knew that she had nothing more to hide from him. She looked at her friend intently and said that the prince was not her type. For this reason, she would refuse him when the time was right. Kun looked at Ophelia intently and with interest and asked with a smile what type of guys she liked. The young lady in turn thought for a moment, going over in her head all the guys she knew. She froze in place in surprise because she knew that the world was simply huge. She did not understand why she had to choose among them. She sighed heavily and said that she liked someone who was not dangerous to her and could protect her. She smiled and said that she would also like him to live with her until he was 100 years old. The prophet looked sideways at the young lady and said that he had heard a very interesting answer. The lady thought for a moment, as she knew it was the pure truth, as it was very difficult to survive in a novel. He looked at her intently and said that if they continued talking, the music would stop. He looked at her with a smile and asked if he could ask her to dance. She looked at him with a smile and agreed to his invitation, dancing joyfully and playfully. The prince, in turn, looked intently at the young people. Kalia slowly approached the crown prince and asked with a smile if he was alone. She smiled, and looking at the young people who were dancing merrily, said that she did not expect that the young lady would be at the party with Mr. Kun. She said that Ophelia was very surprised by her, as was everyone present. She looked closely at the prince and said with a smile that, as far as she knew, Mr. Kun had never brought companions to a banquet. Reynolds sighed heavily and said that who she brought to the banquet was the young lady's personal business and none of their business. He was a little surprised and puzzled because he knew that the young lady had surprised him every time. He had never heard that she was acquainted with the imperial prophet. Kalia looked at the crown prince and said with a smile that he was right. She looked at him and asked if he wanted to dance. Kalia knew perfectly well that if she was the one to dance, the first dance with the crown prince, all the ladies present would be jealous of her. The crown prince looked at the young lady with fury and asked if she was so worried that he was not dancing. Kalia flinched in surprise. A moment later, she was taken aback and said that it wasn't so. She said timidly that she just thought that if he wanted, they could dance. He looked at her with fury and said that he would not dance. The crown prince looked at the young lady intently and said that he was not at all like the marquis, and her tricks would not work on him. He said that he absolutely hated calculating women. The young lady was shocked. She looked at the crown prince with a glare at this statement and asked what was so good about Ophelia. She didn't understand why he didn't hate her. She was furious and screamed. She looked at the prince intently and asked why she was not as good for him as Ophelia. Everyone present froze in surprise and stared intently at the young lady. The crown prince looked at the young lady with anger and said that it appeared that she had lost her composure. She looked at him timidly and asked for forgiveness. The young lady was furious, as she knew it was all Ophelia's fault. A moment later, everyone present was informed that the emperor had arrived at the banquet with the princess. Everyone greeted the emperor and the princess with honor. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that as long as she was able to please His Majesty and the princess, what had happened would easily be forgotten by everyone. She knew that she was still the unrivaled white imperial rose. The man looked closely at everyone present and said with a smile that Duke Caesar was presenting Her Majesty with a natural crystal, and Mrs. Miria was giving the princess ruby jewelry. The young lady slowly approached the princess and said with a smile that she was giving her a carefully selected cake of hers. She looked at the princess with a smile and said that she really hoped that she would like it. The princess looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she loved cakes very much. After the princess tried it, she looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she liked it very much. Kalia, looking at the emperor, said that the dessert was prepared by Mr. Lyand, and she was very glad that she liked everything. The emperor thought for a moment and said that as far as he knew, Andrew Lyant made only 10 desserts a year, and the one who got X even if only one was chosen by him. The emperor looked at the young lady and said that even for the imperial family, there were no exceptions. He did not understand how the young lady could get him. She smiled and said that she had been visiting him for a month and finally persuaded him to sell her the cake. She looked at the emperor intently, as she wanted him to notice how good her intentions were. The emperor looked at her intently and said with a smile that she had put in a lot of effort. She looked at the emperor with a smile and said that it was a great honor for her to make Her Majesty happy. Kun looked at the young lady closely and said that Calliope had presented the cake before her, and now she had less chance. He asked the young lady what she would do now. Ophelia sighed heavily and said that it was okay since she had everything under control. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that Kalia had given the gift before her only to make her look like a fool. She understood perfectly well that she would not allow her to win. A moment later, the young lady approached the emperor and said with a smile that she also had a gift, and she really hoped that they would like it. The princess looked at her with a smile and asked what gift she had. She smiled and told the princess that she had also prepared a cake for her. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked if they were really giving her cake again. She asked if there was nothing else. Kalia, in turn, looked at the young lady with a smirk, as she knew that after tasting a cake made by the best baker in the empire, no one would pay attention to some cake of Ophelia's. Moreover, she knew that there were insects in it, and she was definitely doomed to failure. The young lady smiled and asked the servants to bring gifts to the young lady. Lion slowly brought a beautiful cake into the hall. The young lady said with a smile that she would like to present her birthday gift to the princess. The crown prince froze in surprise as he had never seen anything before. The princess looked at the cake in surprise, as she had never seen anything before. A moment later, the young lady also presented the princess with a beautiful musical card. Everyone present was surprised and shocked, as they had never seen anything like it. They were surprised that simple paper could sing. The young lady smiled and said that she would like to give her the second gift that she had prepared for her. She smiled and said that it was a magic card with a wish. When she was a child, her mother baked her a cake and sang a song for her every birthday. She knew that those were the most precious memories of her life. Ophelia, lighting the candles, said that in her mother's hometown, there was a custom, after a song, to make a wish by blowing out the candles, and then it would definitely come true. The princess looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she made a wish, it would really come true. Ophelia looked at the princess with a smile and said that everything was exactly like that. A moment later, the princess made her wish, and a few minutes later, blew out the candles on the cake. The princess looked at her father and said with a smile that she liked the gift very much. She smiled and said that she would like her brothers to try the cake too. The emperor looked closely at his daughter and agreed with her with a smile. The crown prince looked at the young lady intently. He was surprised. I realized that she always knew how to surprise him. Kalia, in turn, understood perfectly well that as soon as the princess cut the cake and found Ophelia's beetle, there the end will come, and this will be her collapse. The princess, in turn, slowly cut this dessert and distributed it to her brothers. She held out the dessert to her husband with a smile. He looked at her with a smile and thanked her. Kalia was frozen in shock. She thought it was simply impossible. She didn't understand why the bug wasn't in the cake. She was furious because she knew perfectly well that she shouldn't have relied on the maid at all. He looked closely at the young lady and thanked her for making his princess happy. The emperor smiled and said that since his daughter had made a wish, he would reward Ophelia with it. The emperor looked at her intently and said with a smile that she could say whatever she wanted. The young lady was furious, as she was afraid that Ophelia might ask to marry the crown prince. The young lady looked at the emperor intently and asked if she could wish for anything. The emperor looked at her intently and said with a smile that she could of course wish for whatever she wanted. The crown prince looked at her intently, wondering what she wanted this time. The second prince knew that if the emperor gave her to the crown prince, his plan would fail. Ophelia froze in surprise on the spot. She didn't understand why everyone was looking at her so intently. She looked intently at the emperor and said that she had a wish to fulfill, which could not be accomplished without his help. She looked at the emperor intently and said with a smile that she would like to open a candy shop. The emperor looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about, sideways at his son, thinking that he had lost his charm since she had not chosen him. The second prince looked at the young lady with a smile on his face because he saw that it was very interesting that she did not take this opportunity to marry the crown prince, and instead she chose to make such a small request. He was surprised and did not understand what was going on in her mind. Kalia, in turn, looked at the young lady with rage and surprise. She did not understand what she had poisoned herself with. The young lady looked at the emperor intently and said that as far as she knew, most of the ingredients belonged to either the imperial family or the nobles. She sighed heavily and said that children from common families could not taste sweets like Her Highness. She said that if the emperor would supply her shop with ingredients, she was sure that they would spread throughout the empire. She smiled and told the emperor that his kindness would forever be imprinted in the hearts of children who tried these sweets. The princess looked closely. She called his father and said with a smile that this dessert was really very tasty and she would like to share it with the other children. The emperor looked at the young lady and said, Donnie Buddha had many rumors about her, but after their meeting today, he was very surprised. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that the Duchess had given birth to a truly smart and good daughter. The young lady sighed heavily and smiled and told the emperor that he was overpraising her. The emperor looked at her closely and agreed, saying that he would definitely fulfill her wish. The emperor said that from now on, their family would supply her family with ingredients for the dessert for free for 6 months. He smiled and, looking at the young lady, said that they could consider this his personal contribution to the young lady. Ophelia bowed with a smile and thanked the emperor for his kindness. She was glad because she understood that after a long time she finally had her own business. She understood that since the emperor would support her, the confectionery would have a great future. She was very happy because she knew that the children would be able to eat cheap and tasty sweets, and this was just perfect. She knew that her friend and his friends would be very happy to hear this. Everyone looked at the young lady. They couldn't believe that before everyone said that she was stupid and evil, those present were surprised. Since she had received the support of the emperor by just saying a few words, they could no longer insult her after what happened. Everyone looked at the young lady and said that she was their idol today. The young lady was very happy because she understood that she had easily gotten rid of the bad influence of the divorce. Ophelia knew perfectly well that she would have to rely only on herself from now on. Kalia looked at the young lady with fury because she knew that this was not the end. She was furious and wanted to take revenge on the young lady for all her sins. A moment later, the young man approached the emperor and, asking for forgiveness, said that he had something to tell. He said that he had just received news that Miss Ophelia's dress had the coat of arms of the imperial family embroidered on it. The young man said that this was outright contempt. The emperor looked at the young man with anger and asked what he was talking about. The young lady glanced sideways at Kalyu. She wondered if this was her last ace up her sleeve. Ophelia looked hard at the emperor and said that she could swear on her family's reputation that she had been slandered. The emperor looked at the young lady intently and said that using the emperor's crest was a serious violation. He looked at her intently and asked if she had anything to prove her innocence. Ophelia looked at the emperor intently and said that she would go and change her clothes and give them for testing to prove her innocence. The emperor looked closely at the crown prince and said that he was entrusting this matter to him and that he should examine everything carefully. The prince, in turn, agreed with his father and said that he would settle everything. Sometime later, the young lady called her prince. She walked up to him slowly and said that she would like to give him the outfit for inspection. The crown prince looked at the young lady intently and asked why she had not chosen marriage as her wish. She froze in surprise, as she did not expect him to ask something like that. He looked at her intently and said that she kept saying that she loved him. The prince looked at her intently and asked why she hadn't taken the chance to become a princess then. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise. She did not understand what he was saying. She looked at him with a smile and said that she never wanted to get him. So she smiled and said that you can't force someone to be nice. Initially, she was very worried that her father, the new one, will marry her off to someone, so she used the crown prince as her shield. Ophelia understood perfectly well that she could not marry him, since he would kill her in the future. She looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that she knew he hated her, so she was working on it. He looked at her intently and asked what she was trying to achieve. She looked at him with a smile and said that they would certainly lead their attitude to neutral and draw a clear line. She knew that the sword that killed her had passed into the hands of another man, and her father had promised not to marry her off. She knew that she no longer had to pretend to be in love with the prince. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and began to say something to her. Aophelia, in turn, with lightning speed, interrupted him and the Bedouin. Later she gave him a row, and with lightning speed, rushed to the exit. The crown prince was surprised since he wanted to talk to her. Leaving, she asked him to prove her innocence. She thanked him in advance. The crown prince was shocked and shouted after her to stop. With the speed of lightning, he grabbed her hand and pulled her towards him. The crown prince looked at the young lady intently and asked what she thought of him. He held her tightly in his arms, as he did not want her to leave. The prince, in turn, was puzzled and did not understand why the young lady's aloofness and politeness caused him such unbearable pain. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and bewilderment. She asked if this was not what he wanted from her. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked angrily what she was talking about. Aophelia sighed heavily, and looking at the prince, said that he was tired of her always creating problems for him, and he often cleaned up in her public confessions. The crown prince sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, realized that she often forgot about common sense. He looked at her closely and wondered if he really hated her. She sighed heavily and said that there was nothing she could do to help him. Communicating with a person like her, she said that it was better to draw a clear line in their relationship. She sighed heavily and said that everything was fine. As she left, she said that she needed to return to the banquet. The crown prince was in turn frozen in place and did not say a word. The princess ran to Aophelia. In a hurry, she was glad that she was able to find the young lady. The princess looked closely at the young lady and asked if her wish would come true. Aophelia looked at the princess with a smile and said that of course her wish would come true. She said that if the wish came from the heart, then it would definitely come true. Kalia looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smirk if she was really trying to persuade a 3-year-old child to do something. Aophelia, with disdain, and asked, since everyone's wishes will definitely come true, is she trying to propagandize that divine power is higher than the emperor's? Kalia looked at her intently and said that this is disrespect for the emperor's family. The young lady looked at her intently and asked her not to bring politics into this conversation. Kalia looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked for forgiveness. She said that she only wanted to remind her that she could make the princess happy, but she still should watch her language so as not to hurt someone's feelings and not to harm the reputation of the Via family. The young lady looked at her intently, as she had expected. It had hurt her. The princess looked intently at Aophelia, and taking her hand, she asked if the lady was telling the truth about her wish not coming true. The young lady looked at the princess intently and said that it was not so, as God was a little busy. She looked at the princess intently and with a smile asked her why she didn't tell her what she wanted, and she would certainly help her fulfill it and wish. Kalia looked closely at the princess and told her to keep her ears open, as she might be harmed. The princess looked at the young lady intently and said that she had no business here and could come in. Kalia was shocked, as she was unexpectedly hearing something like that from a princess. But still, the young lady agreed and decided to leave them quietly. She looked at the young lady intently, for she knew that she should not rejoice too soon. She understood perfectly well that if the girl could not fulfill the princess's wish, then all her efforts would be in vain. Aophelia, with a smile, looked at the princess and did not ask what she wished for. The princess said with an embarrassed smile that she wanted her older brother to hug her and wish her son a happy birthday. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if she could do it. Aophelia looked at the princess with surprise and confusion, as she did not expect to hear something like that at all. She understood why the princess was talking about something like that, because she knew that in the original, the crown prince was cold to all women, and the little princess loved and feared him at the same time. She knew that God fueled the relationship between them through Kalia, and they later became close. The young lady looked at the princess with her bag and said that she should speak boldly about what she wanted. She said that if the princess loved the crown prince, then she should boldly tell him so that he would understand her feelings. The young lady said sheepishly that she could not do that as he always looked so cold that she was even afraid to talk to him. Ophelia looked at the princess with a smile and said that it was nothing to worry about, and she would certainly teach her how to speak correctly. The princess, in turn, was very happy. She hoped that the young lady would help her in this situation. She looked at the princess intently and said with a smile that she needed to choose the right time and sincere words that would touch the soul. She looked at the princess intently and said that they could now move on to practice. The princess looked at the young lady with a smile and screamed with joy. She smiled and said that now she would learn to confess her feelings. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and began to confess. She looked intently at the princess and said that she loved His Majesty very much. She said with a smile that thanks to his presence, it seemed to her that the wind was warm and the snow was on the floor. She said that he was the only one in her heart. The princess looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she thought she really liked her brother. The young lady was taken aback, for she knew that everything was wrong. She looked at the princess intently and said with a smile that she had only shown her how to speak. She was puzzled and thought that perhaps she had said such a thing in vain. She approached the princess and quietly said that she had such a bad reputation that she was not worthy of the crown prince, that as a supporting character who would be killed by him, she would only be grateful if that did not happen. The crown prince, in turn, froze in place in shock. He looked closely at the young lady and wondered if these were her true feelings. The young lady flinched as she felt someone approaching her from behind. She turned around and froze in surprise as she saw the crown prince. She was shocked and wondered if he had heard what she had just said. She was burning with embarrassment and hoped that he hadn't heard anything. The crown prince looked at the young lady intently and asked if what she had just said was her true intention. The young lady froze in shock. She didn't expect to hear this question. She was puzzled because she understood that he really heard everything. The young lady, in turn, decided not to answer the question posed, and moments later looked at the prince with a smile. She said that the princess would like to tell him something. The princess looked at him intently, called his brother, and called him the crown prince, looked at her coldly, and asked what she wanted. The young lady looked at the princess with a smile and told her to speak her wish boldly. The princess smiled and did not agree with her. A moment later, the princess, looking at her brother, said that she loved him very much and wanted him to hug her. She smiled and said that she would like her brother to personally congratulate her on the holiday. They both looked at him as they expected him to embrace the princess. The crown prince sighed heavily as he realized that he had made a huge mistake. A moment later, he looked closely at his sister and smiled as he congratulated her on her birthday. The princess reached closer to him as she wanted him to hug her. The crown prince looked at his sister closely and said with a smile that she should come closer to him. The princess hugged her brother tightly and said with a smile that she loved him more than anyone in the world. The prince froze in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The young lady stared at them for a moment with a smile on her face. She knew that her task was accomplished. She hoped that they would now become closer to each other. The princess looked closely at the young people and said with a smile that they could see each other later, since she now had to go to her father. The crown prince looked closely after her and agreed with her. Ophelia said that she remembered that she had some business to attend to, so she was forced to leave the prince. When she stayed with him, she felt awkward, caught the young lady with lightning speed, and stopped her. He looked at her intently and asked her in surprise why she was able to tell the princess that she still loved him. The young lady was taken aback and said that she had said nothing of the sort at all, and it seemed to him that she looked at him intently and said with a smile that she was simply teaching the princess how to express her love. He looked at her coldly and asked if it was all a joke. The young lady was taken aback and said that it was exactly like that. She knew perfectly well that she did not suffer from Stockholm Syndrome. She knew that she would never feel any feelings for her killer. The prince looked at the prophet intently and asked with a smile if he was not with the young lady. Kun S looked at the prince with a grin and said that he and the crown prince had things to do without him. The prince froze in shock, as he had not expected to hear anything like that. Kun looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that he always wanted to find an opportunity to talk to one. Prince Ducis smiled and said that this was already very interesting. Kun looked closely at the prince and said that if he became attached to something that did not belong to him, he would lose many times more. The prince, in turn, was taken aback by the prophet's words, since he did not expect to hear such a thing. But a moment later, he thanked him. He smiled and said that, however, for he who had nothing to lose, this could play into his hands. Ducis knew perfectly well that he could not ignore Ophelia, for if she united with Reynold, she would become his greatest threat. He was furious because he knew perfectly well that he had to get her before his brother. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said that she now realized that she was unworthy of being the one who liked him. The prince was shocked. He looked intently at the young lady and cried out that only he could judge this. He looked at her intently and asked her in surprise why she thought he didn't like her. Ophelia froze in shock. She didn't expect that. The Duke looked at his daughter intently and asked why she had not discussed this with him. He sighed, and said that she never had any experience in running a business. He said that opening a store is as easy as she thinks. The young lady looked at her father closely and said that she had no intention of hiding it, but she did not want to disturb him until she had received the emperor's permission. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and said that it seemed he had been too lenient with her since she allowed herself to be insolent. The Duke looked at her and said that since she had made a decision without his permission, she should be held responsible. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that he would not give her a penny and that she would have to find the funds to open the store herself. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect such a year from the Duke. She sighed heavily and in turn wondered why it had all come to this. She was puzzled because she thought that with the support of the emperor, everything would go smoothly. She was shocked because we did not press that her father would refuse her his money. She was opening the store, but in turn, she was glad that she was able to brainwash the crown. Prince Ophelia said that instead of a relationship, she now wants to pursue a career. She understood perfectly well that she did not have much of a choice then. At the banquet, the crown prince pulled her towards him and asked why she thought he didn't like her. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that he was in the future empire and his wife must have many feminine qualities like a white rose. She knew that in the novel, Kalia was the main character and Reynolds' official wife, and she was only a secondary villain whose only option for survival was to do business. She looked at the prince intently and said that her reputation among there had always been at rock bottom. She was puzzled, as she knew that her words were spoken carelessly, but she still wondered why she had spoken like him. She said that only by working hard on her career and proving her worth would she be able to stand next to him with her head held high. She wondered if she just wanted to impress him. He looked at her closely and asked if she really thought so. The young lady smiled, looking at the prince, said that, of course it was. She drew a line between them without hurting his feelings. The crown prince looked at the young lady intently and said that the thing he hated most in life was being deceived and used. He looked at the young lady intently and said that she must remember that he was not a pawn to be thrown away as soon as he became unnecessary. He moved even closer to her and said that today he would personally verify the authenticity of her words. He quietly whispered in her ear that as soon as he found out that she was deceiving him, she would immediately say goodbye to life. The crown prince looked at the young lady intently and asked if she understood him. The young lady was shocked as she realized that her situation was getting worse by the minute. She was shocked, and if she had known that this would happen, she would never have confessed. The next day, chaos reigned in the barracks. The knight looked closely at Lao Yi and said that recently the young lady has not left his side. He asked with a grin, "What happened?" The knight asked him if the dog's place was not enough for him. and he decided to enroll in the young lady's favorites. The knight looked at him with a smirk and told him to accept the fact that he was not an aristocrat at all. He said that if the young man still wanted to remain a knight, then he should stay away from the young lady. He came closer to him and said with contempt that he should not blame them later for their rudeness. A moment later, the young lady entered the barracks and looked at everyone present with anger. She asked what kind of rudeness she was talking about. The knights were taken aback, as they did not expect to see a young lady in such a place. She said angrily that she had heard that there were cases of bullying here, but she did not expect it to be true. She said angrily that her family spends a lot of money on their upkeep. She asked if they were really bullying their colleagues now. The knights trembling with fear before the young lady said that they were wrong. She looked at everyone present and said that she had always been guided by the carrot and stick method, and since something was wrong here, the responsibility lay with her. Ophelia said that today's training would be doubled. She looked at them with her fury and said that they should not even think about relaxing. The knights sighed heavily, but still agreed with the young lady. She was furious because she had put a lot of effort into making her personal knight treat her better. She was shocked because she realized that the knights were just dragging her down. The young lady walked towards her knight with lightning speed. She was excited and looked at him and asked how he was feeling. Lao sighed heavily and looked away. He said that nothing terrible had happened to him, and he was used to this. Ophelia looked at him intently and said that he didn't need to get used to this, because as long as she was here, no one would dare to make fun of him. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked why she was doing such a thing. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she had been very protective of him lately. He said that she was trying to curry favor with him, and this was completely abnormal, since she was trying to gain the favor of an ordinary servant. He looked at the young lady intently and asked her what she wanted from him. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she wanted absolutely nothing from him. She said that she just wanted to correct the mistakes of the past and make him truly devoted to her. She sighed heavily as she realized that he was too perceptive. She understood perfectly well that she needed to win his favor as soon as possible. Otherwise, according to the original, in the future, he would cruelly take revenge on her. The young man looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what had happened that she had decided to come to the dormitory. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she had almost forgotten why she had come to him. She smiled and said that she would like him to accompany her to the Craftsmen's Guild. He looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and asked if she wanted to hire a pastry chef. Why didn't she go straight to the Duke? Lao said that the Duke's family's Chamber of Commerce was one of the 3 largest in the empire. All the Duke had to do was say so, and a whole line of pastry chefs would immediately line up for her, and she would only have to choose. The young lady sighed heavily, and looking at the knight, told him to forget about it, since her father had punished her for her self-will and refused to support her. She sighed heavily and said that regardless of whether she had the ingredients, she would now have to find the funds to open, and the people herself. He looked at the young lady intently and said that the Duke loved her very much, and if she would admit her mistake and say a few kind words, he would melt. He said that he was sure that the Duke would change his mind. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that this was not the case. Ophelia said that when faced with difficulties, she wanted to solve them on her own and not rely on someone else. She looked closely at her knight and said with a smile that he need not worry and that she would certainly find the means. Ophelia, looking at the knight, said that the most important thing now was to find people and train them before the opening. Lao looked at her in surprise. He saw that she was changing before his eyes. Lao sighed heavily and asked her if they should go to the guild, since he knew that the people there were not very nice. She looked at him intently and asked in bewilderment what was wrong with people. He sighed heavily and said that they imperial aristocrats rarely start doing their own thing, because most artisans look down on people like that, especially in this kind of guild, where different people are mixed. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected to hear such a thing. She asked in bewilderment if she was paying them for the work of the craftsman, and they would still belittle her for being a woman. Ophelia, in turn, sighed heavily as she understood that she could not escape her patriarchal habits. Some time later, Ophelia finally arrived at the Guild of Craftsmen. She entered the guild and greeted everyone present with a smile. She smiled and said that she would like to hire confectioners. The man, without looking up at her, said that she should leave, as this was no place for women. He said that she should not interfere in their affairs. The young lady was shocked by his rudeness. She looked at him intently and asked him furiously, "So what if she was a girl?" She asked furiously if she was okay to work with. Shouldn't he treat her accordingly? The man looked closely at the young lady and asked if the man would really pay for her or if she was the main woman after all. Ophelia, in turn, looked at the man with fury and said that, of course, she would pay for everything. She was furious and told him not to look down on her. She knew that even though her father had blocked her access to money, but in the original, she always bought things without thinking about the price. She knew that she had a lot of rare jewelry and trinkets. She thought for a moment because she knew that she would sell all the jewelry and get her first bag of gold. The man looked at the young lady with disdain and said that if she wanted to deceive him, she should first change her clothes. He looked at her closely and said that she was clearly under 20. He did not understand where she got such sums of money. He said with disdain that this was no place for noble ladies to play. He asked her to leave the premises immediately. The young lady was shocked as she understood that she was now also a liar. The knight looked closely at his mistress and said that he had told her earlier that women were not welcome here. The young lady was shocked and said it was simply irrational. The knight looked closely at the prince and asked if they should help the young lady in trouble. The prince sighed heavily and, looking sideways at Ophelia, told his knight to wait a little. He first wanted to see what the young lady was capable of. The young lady, in turn, looked at the man with fury and said that he had no right to drive her away, interfere with legitimate employment without good reason. She said that violators will be dealt with as those who hinder the development of the empire's economy. The man froze in shock. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she knew the laws of the empire. She sighed heavily and, looking at the man, said that these were the basic requirements for Togo to start his own business. She said with fury that he should not shirk any longer. Otherwise, she would sue him for obstructing the opening of the store. She said with fury that after this, he would have to try prison soup. The man's face changed with lightning speed. He looked intently at the young lady and said that he had something to say, and he asked her to go into the reception room where they could talk freely. She was furious and screamed that this was not enough. The young man looked at his mistress in surprise and wondered if she had really read the imperial code. He did not understand how she could understand such a complex book. He remembered very well that she did not know most of the words, and all the teachers left her in anger. The man looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that he had just gathered all the pastry chefs. He smiled and said that if everything was okay with her, then he was asking for her deposit. The young lady looked at the man in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She was surprised because she did not expect that she would have to bring out a deposit. She looked at him intently and said that she had no spare money with her, but she promised to bring everything in 2 days. Ophelia was puzzled because if she had known that they would deduct money from her in advance, she would have first gone to the pawn shops and exchanged all her jewelry. The man shouted angrily that, as he had said, she was only talking. And in the end, it turns out that her face is as often as her wallet. He shouted that she had no money, but at the same time she still decided to spend half of his day. As she shouted that she should immediately leave their premises and not interfere with work, everyone present shouted that she was a liar and business was not for her. They mocked her and said that all that women were allowed to do was serve a man and bear children. The young lady was furious at their words. She, in turn, looked at everyone present, as she already wanted to tell them everything. Some time later, the prince came up to them and asked them with a smile how many coins they needed for the deposit. He said with a smile that he would pay the deposit. Ophelia froze in surprise. She did not expect to see the prince in such a place. The prince looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he did not expect to meet her in such a place, as he was there on his own business. She looked at him with a smile and said that it was just a coincidence. She was in shock because she realized that she was almost shot because of lack of money, and now she met him. She felt humiliated and lost face. The young lady looked at the prince intently and thanked him with a smile for his kindness. A moment later, she said that she didn't need his help at all. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she was saying that. He asked if she would reject him again. He sighed heavily and said sadly that her words at the banquet still rang in his head. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said that she had thought carefully about his proposal, but unfortunately she could not accept it. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked why she made such a choice. He asked if she really thought he was not as good as his brother. Ophelia looked at the prince and said that it was not so. She thought it was because she was not good enough. She said that she only wanted to open a candy store so that she could train. Ophelia said that she hoped that one day she would become a wonderful person, like the princes. Ducis looked at the young lady with a sad expression on her face. The prince said that, although she had rejected him that day and returned the jewels he had given her, he very much hoped that she would at least not reject her friendship with him. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that it was a great honor for her to be friends with such an outstanding man. She was in shock. She didn't understand why the villain was picking on her, since she wasn't the main character, but just a secondary character. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that since they were friends, he could very well put down a deposit for her. The young lady froze in shock. She did not expect this. She looked at him timidly and said quickly that unfortunately she could not accept this and agreed to something else. She said that he did not need to do anything like that at all. The prince looked at her and asked with a smile what they should do. Now, he said, that if she did not make a deposit, then others could take the confectioners she liked. The prince, in turn, heard that Duke O was cutting off the young lady's flow of funds. He knew that she was now in despair. He understood perfectly well that if he now extended a helping hand to her in such a cruel time, then in the future it would strengthen their friendship, and she would never forget his help. The young lady looked at everyone present and said with a smile that if any of these confectioners wanted to leave for another employer, she would not dare to stop them. The prince froze in shock on the spot. He did not expect to hear such a thing from her. She looked at everyone present and said that she probably didn't say it, but the empire's top pastry chef, Andrew Liant, would be working for her. Everyone present looked at the young lady with distrust, as they knew that even the imperial family could not persuade him to work for her. They shouted that anyone could think of such a thing, but she had to show proof. The young man froze in shock, and looking at the young lady wondered what kind of nonsense she was talking about. He knew that she had not even received the support of the Duke. She had neither money nor connections. She did not understand how she could persuade such a pastry chef. She looked at everyone present and said with a smile that it was up to them to decide whether to believe it or not. She smiled and said that no one had inherited the pro's skills. She smiled and said that she came here only to recruit students for him. Everyone present was shocked. They looked closely at the young lady and asked with disbelief if she was really cooperating directly with the gentleman. They said that if they learned his recipes, they would live for the rest of their days and not need money. They said that they would go to work for her without a deposit if she would put in a few words with him. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had proof that he was working for her. He understood that if this was true, his pastry chefs would run away. The prince looked closely at the young lady and wondered how many aces she had up her sleeve. The young lady looked at them intently and said that, of course, she had proof. She looked at them intently and said that in a few days she would bring him to their guild. She said that she would also pay the deposit then, so they didn't have to worry. Lao looked at the young lady closely and asked why she lied. He said that if she didn't bring the pastry chef to the guild in a few days, her lie would be exposed, and it would cause irreparable damage to the reputation of the Via family. The young lady looked closely at her knight and asked with a smile if he was worried about her. Lao sighed heavily and said that he was simply speaking the right decision, since this was one of the duties of a knight. Ophelia looked closely at the knight because she knew that although he was putting on a proud face, in reality, he was very worried about her. Ophelia looked at him closely and said with a smile that he didn't need to worry, as she didn't do anything she wasn't sure about. She smiled and said that since she said that, it meant she had a way to invite him there. Ophelia knew that in the original, the pastry chef's wife had died, and he had to look after 2 children. But unfortunately, one day his children disappeared, and he went crazy. After that, he became indifferent to fame and wealth. He was only interested in finding his children. Later, Kalia found his children, and that's how she got the cake he made for the princess. But she had no idea how the young lady got the cake this time. She sighed heavily, as she knew perfectly well that this was not the way it was in the original plot, because she knew that it was all because the lost children of the pastry chef were Ur and Tia from the Via house. The young lady looked at the prince intently and offered him tea. He said that he did not need anything, as he only came to talk to her about supplies and specific ingredients. She looked at the crown prince in surprise, as she did not understand how he could be sent on such a trivial matter. She was surprised because he decided to do everything himself. She realized that he was very dedicated to his work. The crown prince said that he heard that she went to the Craftsmen's Guild yesterday. He looked at her closely and asked how the meeting went. In turn, the crown prince came to her only to meet her. She looked at the prince with a smile and said that there was something that she had already solved the problem. She was shocked, did not understand how he knew about it. She wondered how many people in the empire already knew about what happened. He looked at her intently and said that his father had ordered him to help her open the store, so no matter what problems she had, she could come to him, and he would definitely help her. The young lady looked at him intently and thanked him. She smiled and said that she didn't need any more help at the moment. She knew perfectly well that the plot had long since departed from the original, and the chance of him killing her was minimal. For this reason, she could easily just keep her distance from him. The crown prince looked at her intently and said that he had heard that the duke had refused to separate her from the relapse. Reynolds looked at her puzzled and asked how she was going to open a shop and hire craftsmen without money. She looked at the prince with a smile and said that she had already selected the artisans. She smiled and said that she would simply ask Andrew Liant to work for her, and they would come running to her. The crown prince looked at the young lady in surprise. He saw that she had plenty of ambition, but he knew that the man was the #1 confectioner in the empire. She looked at the prince intently for days and said with a smile that everything was correct, and the same pastry chef who baked the cake that Kalia presented to the princess. The prince looked at the young lady intently and told them that he was a man even refused to work for the imperial family. He did not understand why she suddenly assumed that he would work for her. The prince said that if she needed a good master, he could help her with this. He understood perfectly well that she was simply a spoiled lady because she had never known difficulties and, moreover, did not understand how to run a business. He thought that she was simply a dreamer. The young lady looked at him intently and said that it must be Andrew Liant and no one else. The prince stood frozen in shock on the spot looking at the young lady. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she was clinging to him so much. She smiled and said that desserts have always been only for the upper classes. With these high prices comes huge profits. She said that if she starts selling cheap desserts, it will definitely harm some individuals. She said that they understand perfectly well that they will try to suppress her. Ophelia looked at the prince and said that if she wanted to confront them, she needed a pastry chef who had absolute authority and was not afraid of power, Ophelia knew that Andrew Leont was the best candidate. Reynolds looked at the young lady and said that he had not expected her to think about it at all, but for a moment he thought about it himself and said that she was indeed right, since there would be chaos after the valuable ingredients entered the market of ordinary people. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that, for this reason, she must invite a famous pastry chef. Reynolds looked at the young lady closely. He knew that she had previously given him another plan to defeat the empire. He believed that it was the Duke's merit, and his goal was for her to become the crown princess, so he allowed her to approach. But now, he could not deny the fact that the young lady had her own head on her shoulders. The prince was surprised and did not understand why she had not yet become famous, possessing such wisdom. He looked closely at the young lady and asked how she was going to attract him. He asked if she had any plan. The young lady said with a smile that, of course, she had a plan, and she was planning to visit him today. He looked at her closely and said that although he did not understand where she got so much self-confidence from, he still decided to remind her that since her father had promised to help her with the opening, he would oversee the entire process. The young lady looked at the prince in bewilderment, as she did not expect to hear such a thing from him. He looked at the young lady closely and said that she must not do anything unnecessary, and he must make sure that the imperial family was not involved in this. He said that he would immediately go with her. She was furious because she knew perfectly well that his reason was too far-fetched. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he really wanted to go too. The prince looked at the young lady intently and asked if there was any problem. Ophelia was taken aback and said that of course there was no problem. She looked at the prince intently and said with a smile that the more people, the more effort, and she was very glad that he decided to go with her. In turn, she was surprised and did not understand why he decided to follow her. He looked at the young lady intently and said that they could just go without further ado. A moment later she said that he should wait a little, as she had 2 important people to call. Ure approached the young lady with lightning speed and asked with a smile what she wanted. The young lady looked at her maid and asked with a smile how her brother was doing. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she was very grateful to her for her concern. She said that her brother was fine. He was already sleeping and eating steadily, and he also learned fencing from the night, and he asked to tell her that he missed her very much. The young lady looked at her maid and said with a smile that she should bring her brother and they should accompany her to one place together. Some time later, they arrived at the pastry chef's estate. She was shocked as she saw that there were many people in front of him. She sighed heavily and said that more people had come to visit him than she expected. The prince looked at her intently and said that, as expected, she would hardly be able to see his face today and there could be no talk of work. He simply couldn't believe that he was following her from the estate itself. The butler looked closely at everyone present and asked only those who had an invitation to stay. He asked the rest to leave. The young lady in turn pushed her way through the crowd of people, shouting that they should let her through. The young lady looked closely at the butler and introduced herself. She said that yesterday she had sent a knight to them and conveyed the news. The butler looked closely at the young lady and said that she could pass, as the gentleman had been expecting her for a long time. He looked intently at the young gentleman who stood before him. The young lady looked at the butler intently and said that these were the young men she had mentioned in the letter. The butler looked closely at the young people, and with a smile on his face, he was very glad to see them. Brother and sister looked at each other as they were addressed as Sir and Madam. The young lady looked at the butler intently and asked if they could come in. He said that of course she could come in. The butler looked intently at the crown prince and, asking for forgiveness, said that unfortunately he was not passing. The crown prince looked at the butler with rage and told him to immediately state the reason why he could not enter. The butler looked at the prince and said that he had sent a mansion for everyone equal, even if it was the king himself. First he had to get the master's permission. The young lady looked at the butler with a smile and said that it was just a misunderstanding since he was with them. Ophelia, in turn, could not stop laughing since even a prince could be sent here. The butler, in turn, asked for forgiveness and said that the prince could come in. The prince did not answer. Yor looked closely at the young lady and asked why she brought them to this place. She thought for a moment and said that she had come to a familiar place. Moments later, the butler informed the gentleman that a young lady had arrived to visit them. Ophelia looked at the man with a smile and said that she had brought his children to him. The young people looked at each other in bewilderment, as they did not understand what was being discussed. Ophelia looked intently at her maid and said that the master was their long-lost father. The young men stood frozen in shock, looking at the gentleman. They couldn't believe what they had just heard. The gentleman, in turn, looked intently at his dear children. Memories from the recent past came to mind. He looked at them intently and, with tears in his eyes, said that it was true. Urs, with tears in her eyes and trembling, called her father. The man looked closely at his children and said with a smile that he had finally found them. He hugged them tenderly. In turn, she looked at them intently. She knew that, and because of her knowledge of the original, she understood who Yor was seeing her for the first time. She knew that in the original story, Ophelia loved to mock the servants. So when her brother and sister found out about their father, she again suffered the fate of a villain. She knew that she had supported her brother and sister, and she had also changed her destiny and erased all the villainous things from her name. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that he had been thinking about what opportunity she would take advantage of, but she had indeed managed to impress the gentleman. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said that the most important thing in this story was that they were finally able to reunite and become a family again. The man looked at the young lady intently and said that she had done him a great favor. He asked what she wanted in return. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that he had shown her the imperial family's food storehouse. He said that next he would introduce her to the supplier of the ingredients. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that he had been fussing over her all day.